Tonight we're going to explore something that sits at the heart of Westerosi history, something quieter than battles but just as deadly. We'll journey through the promises made between great houses, the betrothals that were meant to prevent wars, and discover how the breaking of these sacred vows brought about the very bloodshed they were designed to avoid. We'll understand why a broken promise between two young people could shatter kingdoms and send thousands to their graves. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a tale of endless tragedy and betrayal, though tragedies there certainly were. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the human stories behind these political arrangements, the choices made by lords and ladies, the impossible positions in which honour and desire placed them. If you enjoy these calm explorations of Westeros, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, and let's begin our slow drift through the promises that broke kingdoms. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Before we can understand why broken betrothals brought down kingdoms, we need to understand what marriage meant in Westeros, and it meant something quite different from what we might imagine today. Marriage in the Seven Kingdoms was never primarily about love, though love might occasionally blossom within it. It was currency, as real and valuable as gold dragons or castles or armies. When a lord promised his daughter to another lord's son, he was not simply arranging a wedding. He was forging an alliance, combining the military strength of two houses, creating obligations that would bind families together across generations. The marriage bed, in this sense, was a battlefield where wars were prevented or prepared for, where the fate of thousands could be decided by the joining of two bodies. The practice of arranging betrothals, sometimes when the children involved were still in their cradles, might seem strange or even cruel to us now, but in the context of Westeros, where winter could last a decade and wipe out entire populations, where wars between houses could simmer for centuries, where a strong alliance might mean the difference between prosperity and extinction, these early promises made a certain desperate sense. A lord looking at his infant daughter would be thinking not of her happiness 20 years hence, but of what alliances he needed, what enemies he had to placate, what borders needed securing. The child was a piece on the board, valuable precisely because she could be moved, traded, positioned to strengthen the house's position in the great game. But a betrothal was more than just a political calculation. It was a sacred promise, blessed by the faith of the Seven in the south, or sworn before the old gods in the north. When a lord gave his word that his child would marry another lord's child, he was staking his honour on that promise. Honour, in Westeros, was not an abstraction. It was the foundation of trust between houses, the glue that held the feudal system together. If a man's word meant nothing, if promises could be broken whenever convenience dictated, then the entire structure of alliances and obligations would collapse into chaos. Everyone would suspect everyone else, and the only recourse would be constant warfare, every house against every other. The strict enforcement of promises, particularly marriage promises, was what made cooperation possible in a world that tended naturally toward violence and suspicion. The faith taught that a betrothal, once properly made and blessed, created a bond nearly as sacred as marriage itself. The Septons would say that the man and woman were joined in the eyes of the Seven, even if they had not yet shared a bed, even if they had never met. To break such a bond was to break a vow made before the gods, to invite divine displeasure along with earthly consequences. The High Septon himself had the authority to dissolve betrothals, but only for grave cause, and only rarely. The faith's position on this matter was not mere theology, it served a practical purpose. If betrothals could be easily broken, they would lose their power to prevent wars, to bind houses together in mutual interest. The difficulty of breaking these promises was precisely what made them valuable. In the north, where the old gods held sway and the faith's power was weaker, the cultural weight of betrothals was, if anything, even stronger. The Northmen were known throughout the Seven Kingdoms for their rigid sense of honour, for keeping their word even when it cost them dearly. When a northern lord made a promise before the heart tree, with those ancient carved faces watching, he knew that breaking that promise would shame not just himself but his entire house, would call into question every agreement his family had ever made or ever would make. The North was a harsh land where trust between houses was essential for survival, and so the Northmen guarded their reputations for honour more jealously than their southern counterparts guarded their gold. The actual mechanics of arranging a betrothal were complex and formal. Maesters would be involved, drafting agreements that specified not just who would marry whom, but what each house would contribute to the alliance. Dowries were negotiated, sometimes involving staggering amounts of wealth, land, or military support. A great house marrying its daughter to a lesser house might demand that the lesser house commit its full military strength to the great house's wars. A house sending its son to marry a daughter might receive lands, castles, trading privileges. These negotiations could take months or even years, with ravens flying back and forth between castles, with maesters calculating the value of various offers, with lords weighing the strategic advantages against the political costs. The betrothal ceremony itself, when agreement was finally reached, would be witnessed by as many people as possible. This was not a private arrangement, but a public commitment. Lords from allied houses would attend, serving as witnesses who could later testify that the vows were properly made. Septons or godswads would solemnize the promises. Often, the betrothed couple would exchange tokens, rings or cloaks or other symbols that represented their pledge. The more public and formal the ceremony, the harder it would be to later claim the betrothal was invalid or had never truly been made. Everyone present became invested in the alliance, their own honour tied to seeing the promise fulfilled. What made a betrothal truly binding, as opposed to mere preliminary discussions, was a matter that occupied legal scholars and septons for centuries. Generally, a betrothal required the formal consent of both parties, or, in the case of children too young to consent, the consent of their guardians with the authority to speak for them. It required some form of public declaration and blessing, and it required, in most interpretations, the exchange of something valuable, whether a dowry payment, a military commitment, or at minimum the promises themselves spoken aloud before witnesses. Once these conditions were met, the betrothal took on legal force. The couple were considered bound to each other, and any attempt to marry one of them to someone else would be treated as bigamy, a serious crime. But betrothals existed in a strange legal space between promise and fulfillment. They were binding, but not as binding as marriage. They created obligations, but not quite the same obligations as the marriage vows themselves. This ambiguity, this space between promise and consummation, created opportunities for the ambitious and the desperate. If circumstances changed, if a better alliance presented itself, if the strategic situation shifted, a house might begin to look for ways to escape a betrothal that no longer served its interests. The question then became, what could justify breaking such a sacred promise? What could possibly be worth the shame, the anger, the potential for violence that would follow? In theory, very little could justify it. The death of one of the betrothed certainly would end the arrangement, though sometimes a substitute would be offered, a younger brother or sister to take the dead child's place and preserve the alliance. A revelation that one party was already married or had taken vows of celibacy might invalidate the betrothal. Proof of some terrible crime or moral failing might give grounds for dissolution, though what counted as sufficient grounds was often disputed. Impotence, madness, gross physical deformity discovered after the betrothal was made, these traditional grounds for annulment of marriages were sometimes applied to betrothals as well. But here is what the histories show us. When powerful people wanted to break a betrothal, they found reasons. When the political calculus changed, when desire overwhelmed duty, when prophecy seemed to demand it, when fear or ambition or love complicated the careful arrangements of maester and lords, the reasons would materialize, A septon could be found to declare the betrothal improperly made. Evidence of some disqualifying condition would conveniently surface. Or, if all else failed, the promise would simply be broken, honour be damned, and the consequences would be faced as they came. This is where our story truly begins, in that moment when someone decided that their reasons for breaking their word outweighed everything their society said about the sanctity of promises. The women in these arrangements, it must be said, bore a particular burden. In Westerosi society, with few exceptions, women had limited control over their own fates. A daughter was her father's to dispose of in marriage, as he saw fit, and then she became her husband's property in all but name. The faith taught that women should be obedient and dutiful, that their role was to bind houses together through their bodies, to produce heirs, to serve as symbols of alliance. A woman betrothed as a child had no say in the matter. As she grew, she might develop feelings about her intended husband, might dread or anticipate the marriage, but her feelings were largely irrelevant to everyone involved. What mattered was the alliance, the strategic benefit to her house. When a betrothal was broken, women often suffered most acutely. If a man broke his promise to marry a woman, she was shamed. Her value on the marriage market diminished. Who would want to marry the woman that another man had rejected? The stain of a broken betrothal could follow a woman for her entire life, limiting her prospects, inviting whispers and speculation. Had she done something to drive her intended husband away? Was there some flaw in her, some hidden defect that had caused him to break his word? The injustice of this was rarely acknowledged. A man might break a betrothal and face political consequences, might lose allies or provoke enemies, but his personal honour as a man was rarely questioned in the same way a woman's virtue and desirability would be questioned. Conversely, when a woman was the one who wanted to escape a betrothal, her options were even more limited. She could not simply declare the arrangement void. She had no legal standing to break the contract her father or guardian had made. Her only recourses were indirect. She might try to convince her father that the marriage would be disastrous, though this required having a father who valued her opinion over political advantage. She might hope that her intended husband would die or prove unsuitable in some public way. Or, in the most desperate cases, she might flee, might enter a sept and take vows, might do something so scandalous that her intended husband would refuse to marry her. Though this last option often ended in tragedy rather than freedom. Yet some alliances did succeed. Some betrothals made in childhood led to marriages that brought genuine peace and even happiness. The great houses could point to numerous examples where a strategic marriage had prevented a war, where former enemies had become loyal allies bound by blood and grandchildren. When a betrothal was honoured, when both parties went to the wedding as promised, the result was often prosperity for both houses. Trade increased between allied regions, military cooperation became possible, disputes were settled through family mediation rather than violence. These successes were the reason the system persisted, the reason that lords continued to betroth their children to each other despite all the complications and risks. The maesters who served the great houses maintained detailed records of betrothals and marriages, tracking the web of alliances that connected every house to every other house, however distantly. A master could tell you that House Stark was connected to House Royce through a marriage 3 generations past, that House Lannister had ties to House Crakehall going back a century, that the Tyrells and Hightowers had intermarried so often that separating the bloodlines was nearly impossible. These connections mattered. When war came, lords would look to these marriage ties to determine who might be relied upon, who owed loyalty to whom, where the fault lines would fall. A broken betrothal disrupted these calculations, created uncertainty where there should have been certainty, opened spaces for betrayal where there should have been blood bonds. The system of marriage alliances worked, when it worked, because everyone understood the rules and generally followed them. A kind of honour existed among the great houses, a sense that while you might scheme against your rivals in countless ways, while you might plot and manoeuvre for advantage, You did not lightly break your sworn word. To do so was to step outside the bounds of acceptable behaviour, to mark yourself as untrustworthy, to invite retaliation not just from the wronged house, but from all houses who relied on the sanctity of promises to manage their own affairs. Breaking a betrothal was not just a private betrayal, but a threat to the entire system of noble alliances. And yet, betrothals were broken. Despite everything we have discussed, despite the sacred nature of these promises, despite the practical reasons for keeping them, despite the cultural weight of honour and the political cost of betrayal, lords and ladies throughout Westerosi history found themselves breaking these vows. Sometimes they did so reluctantly, forced by circumstances beyond their control. Sometimes they did so deliberately, choosing a different path even knowing the consequences. Sometimes they did so for love, for prophecy, for ambition, for fear. And when these promises broke, kingdoms often broke with them. The most famous broken betrothal in Westerosi history, the one that changed everything, began not with grand passion or dramatic conflict, but with what seemed like a perfectly sensible political arrangement. In the year 279 after Aegon's conquest, Lord Rickard Stark of Winterfell and Lord Steffon Baratheon of Storm's End agreed that Rickard's daughter Lyanna would marry Steffon's son Robert. It was the kind of alliance we discussed earlier, meant to bind the North and the Stormlands together, to create a friendship between two great houses that might benefit both for generations to come. On parchment, in the careful records the maesters kept, it looked like dozens of other successful betrothals. There was no reason to think this one would be different, no sign that this particular promise would lead to war. Robert Baratheon was, by all accounts, exactly the sort of young man who should have made a good match. He was handsome and strong, a warrior of exceptional skill even in his youth, destined to inherit one of the great houses of Westeros. He was fostered at the Eyrie alongside Eddard Stark, Lyanna's brother, and the two young men had become as close as brothers, perhaps closer. The friendship between Robert and Ned made the betrothal even more appealing to Lord Rickard. His daughter would not be marrying a stranger but the dear friend of his son, a man Ned trusted completely, a man who would be bound to House Stark by both friendship and marriage. What could be better than such an arrangement? But Lyanna Stark was not a woman whose feelings aligned neatly with political convenience. The histories tell us less about her than we might wish, as is so often the case with women in Westeros, but what they do tell us paints a picture of someone fierce and independent, someone who chafed at the restrictions placed upon her gender. She was skilled with horses, an exceptional rider. She had, according to some accounts, a wildness in her that the conventional role of lady and wife could not easily contain. Whether she ever loved Robert Baratheon, whether she ever wanted to marry him, we cannot know with certainty. She left no letters expressing her feelings, no diary recording her thoughts. We have only the observations of others, filtered through their own perspectives and biases. Robert, for his part, seemed to believe he loved her, or perhaps he loved the idea of her, the beautiful northern girl who would be his wife, who would give him sons to carry on House Baratheon. The Robert we meet in the histories after Lyanna's death is obsessed with her memory, speaking of her constantly, comparing every woman unfavourably to her, building her up in his mind into an ideal of feminine perfection. But this Robert, the one who could not stop mourning the woman he lost, may not be a reliable guide to what the actual Lyanna was like, or what their marriage might have been. Robert loved to drink and fight and bed women. He was loud where Lyanna, by all accounts, was more reserved. He was conventional in his ideas about women's roles where she was rebellious. They might have grown into affection for each other, or they might have been miserable together. We will never know, and perhaps that is why Robert could love her forever in memory, because she never became the real, complicated, sometimes disappointing person a wife eventually reveals herself to be. Eddard Stark, watching his sister and his best friend prepare for a marriage that would bind them all together, must have felt confident that he was seeing the future take shape in exactly the way it should. He loved them both. He wanted them both to be happy. And he had no reason to suspect that Lyanna harboured doubts about the match. Or if he did suspect, perhaps he told himself that she would come to accept it, that duty would win out over whatever reservation she might have. This is what women did in Westeros. They married where their fathers commanded, and they made the best of it. Lyanna was strong. She would adapt. She would find a way to be content with Robert, even if she was not passionately in love with him. Then came the tourney at Harrenhal, in the year 281 after the conquest, and everything changed. Tourneys were common enough in Westeros, spectacles where knights could display their prowess, and lords could see and be seen, where alliances were strengthened and rivalries played out in relatively controlled violence. But the tourney at Harrenhal was something larger, something grander than the usual affairs. Lord Went, whose castle of Harrenhal still bore the scars of dragonfire from the conquest nearly 300 years earlier, hosted what was perhaps the greatest tourney the Seven Kingdoms had ever seen. Knights came from every corner of the realm. The finest fighters in Westeros gathered to compete, and there, in the great hall and on the tourney grounds, the fate of the realm was quietly, almost accidentally set in motion. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen attended the tourney, as did his wife Elia Martell of Dorne. Rhaegar was, by all accounts, a study in contrast to Robert Baratheon. Where Robert was loud and physical and straightforward, Rhaegar was melancholy and artistic, a man who played the harp and wrote songs, who was said to make women cry with the beauty of his music. He was handsome in a way that seemed almost otherworldly, with the silver-gold hair and purple eyes of the Targaryen line. He was also married, and not just married, but married to a Dornish princess whose presence at the tourney represented her house's alliance with the Iron Throne. Whatever Hrothgar felt, whatever he might have wanted, duty and honour demanded that he be faithful to his wife, and mindful of his responsibilities as heir to the throne. Lyanna was at the tourney as well, attending with her father and brothers. Robert was there, probably already drinking too much, certainly competing in the lists and doing well as he usually did in martial competitions. The whole realm seemed to have gathered at Harrenhal, and for a few days the Seven Kingdoms felt like one kingdom, united in celebration and spectacle. It should have been a joyous occasion, a moment of peace and festivity before everyone returned to their usual concerns and conflicts. Instead, it became the beginning of the end for so much and so many. The stories about what happened at Harrenhal have been told and retold so many times that separating truth from legend is nearly impossible. We know that Rhaegar won the tourney, defeating knight after knight until he stood as champion. We know that, by tradition, the champion would crown a queen of love and beauty, a lady to whom he would dedicate his victory. We know that everyone expected Rhaegar to crown his wife Elia, because what else would a married man, a prince, do in such a public setting? And we know that instead he rode past Elia, past all the high-born ladies watching, and placed a crown of blue winter roses in Lyanna Stark's lap. The silence that followed this gesture must have been extraordinary. Imagine being there, watching as the heir to the Iron Throne publicly honoured another man's betrothed, passed over his own wife to do so. The insult to Elia was obvious and devastating. The impropriety of honouring Lyanna, who was promised to Robert, was clear to everyone present. What could Rhaegar have been thinking? Was it a momentary impulse? A romantic gesture made without considering the consequences? Was it a declaration of feeling that he could not contain, regardless of who might be hurt? Or was it something else, something more calculated, though to what purpose we cannot say? Some have suggested that Rhaegar was driven by prophecy, that he had become obsessed with the idea of the prince that was promised, a figure from ancient prophecies who would save the world from darkness. Perhaps he believed that Lyanna had some role to play in this prophecy, that she was meant to be the mother of this promised prince rather than Elia, who was said to be too frail to bear more children after her difficult labours. If this was true, if Rhaegar's actions were driven by a genuine belief that the fate of the world depended on him and Lyanna coming together, Does it excuse what he did? Does cosmic necessity justify personal betrayal? The question has no easy answer. What we know is that something shifted in that moment when the winter roses landed in Lyanna's lap. Whether it was the beginning of love or the triggering of a chain of events that had been waiting to unfold, whether Lyanna welcomed the attention or was horrified by it, whether Rhaegar acted from the heart or from some more complex calculation, the world before that moment and the world after were not the same. Robert saw the woman he was to marry being honoured by another man, a married man. A prince. Brandon and Eddard Stark saw their sister being publicly singled out in a way that was both honour and insult. And Lyanna, what did she see? What did she feel? We can only guess. The months that followed are even more obscured by conflicting accounts and partisan histories. What seems clear is that at some point, roughly a year after the tourney, Rhaegar and Lyanna disappeared together. The official story, the one Robert believed, and the one that justified the war that followed, was that Rhaegar abducted Lyanna, kidnapped her and took her away by force, doing gods know what to her in captivity. This version paints Rhaegar as a villain who betrayed his marriage vows, violated guest right, and committed what was essentially an act of war against House Stark by stealing away their daughter. It is a version that makes the rebellion that followed a righteous cause, a rescue mission, and a quest for justice. But there are other versions, whispered rather than proclaimed, that suggest Lyanna went willingly, that she and Rhaegar had fallen in love, or believed they had, and chose to be together despite the impossibility of it, despite everything that stood in their way, that she ran from a betrothal she didn't want, to a man she could not love, towards something that seemed like freedom or destiny, or at least a choice of her own making. This version is harder to accept for many reasons. It makes Lyanna complicit in the chaos that followed. It suggests that she knew her choice would hurt people and made it anyway. It raises uncomfortable questions about duty and desire, about whether love can ever justify the breaking of sacred vows and the destruction of carefully made plans. We will never know for certain which version is true, or if the truth lies somewhere between these extremes. Perhaps Rhaegar did take her by force, or perhaps she convinced herself she was willing when in fact she was being manipulated by a prince who had power over her in ways she did not fully recognize. Perhaps she truly loved him and went joyfully. Perhaps it was all prophecy and politics and had little to do with love at all. The only two people who knew the truth are long dead, and they left no clear account of what happened between them. What is certain is how Brandon Stark responded when word reached him that his sister was gone, that Rhaegar had taken her. Brandon was the eldest of Rickard Stark's children, the heir to Winterfell, a young man known for his hot temper and his fierce protectiveness of his family. When he heard about Lyanna, he did not stop to question, did not pause to consider strategy or consequences. He rode straight to King's Landing with several companions and shouted for Rhaegar to come out and die. It was a moment of pure, thoughtless courage, exactly the kind of action that might work in songs but rarely works in reality. Brandon was demanding that the heir to the throne face him in combat, accusing a prince of the realm of heinous crimes, in the hearing of the Mad King Aerys. King Aerys Targaryen was already slipping into the madness that would define his later years. He'd grown paranoid, cruel, unpredictable. He saw plots everywhere, believed enemies were constantly working against him. When Brandon Stark appeared at his gates shouting challenges at his son, Aerys did not see a young man defending his sister's honour. He saw treason, rebellion, an attack on the royal family. He had Brandon arrested along with the companions who had ridden with him, and then he sent word to their fathers, including Rickard Stark, to come to King's Landing to answer for their son's crimes. Lord Rickard came, of course. What choice did he have? His son was imprisoned, his daughter was missing, and the king himself had summoned him. He must have known it was a trap, or at least suspected, but the bonds of duty and family left him no alternative. He came to King's Landing, and there King Aerys showed exactly how mad he'd become. Rather than granting Rickard a trial, or even a formal hearing, Aerys accused him of treason and demanded trial by combat. But the king's champion, he declared, would be fire itself. Rickard Stark was suspended above a fire, slowly roasted alive in his own armour while his son Brandon was placed in a device that let him struggle to try to save his father, with a leather cord around his neck that tightened as he struggled, so that in trying to help his father he strangled himself. The cruelty of these executions was extraordinary even by the standards of Aerys's later atrocities. These were great lords, men entitled by every law and custom to formal trials, to the protections that high birth provided. Instead, they were murdered in ways designed to maximize suffering and terror, and their deaths meant that a betrothal, a simple promise of marriage between Lyanna Stark and Robert Baratheon, had now cost 2 lives and created a blood debt that could only be answered with more blood. But Aerys was not done. After killing Rickard and Brandon, he sent messages to Jon Arryn, the Lord of the Eyrie, where both Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon had been fostered as boys. The king demanded that Jon Arryn send him the heads of these 2 young men, his former wards, so they could be executed as well. The logic, if it can be called logic, was that they too were implicated in the treason of calling for Rhaegar's death, that they too must pay with their lives. Aerys was demanding that Jon Arryn betray the bonds of fosterage, murder the boys he had raised as his own sons, for the crime of being associated with the Starks. Jon Arryn was an old man, cautious and measured, not given to rash action. He had lived through decades of Targaryen rule, had seen the realm at war and at peace, had learned the value of patience and diplomacy. But this demand was too much. Instead of sending the heads of Ned and Robert, he raised his banners in rebellion. He chose to go to war with the Iron Throne rather than betray the young men he had fostered, and with that choice, the war that would later be called Robert's Rebellion truly began, though it might as easily have been called Aerys's madness, or Rhaegar's folly, or Lyanna's choice, depending on where you place the blame. Robert Baratheon fought that war believing he was rescuing his betrothed from a kidnapper, avenging the murder of his best friend's father and brother, fighting against a mad king who had to be stopped before he destroyed the realm entirely. He was fighting for Lyanna, or so he told himself and everyone else. The image of her suffering at Rhaegar's hands must have driven him forward through battles and hardships. And when he finally faced Rhaegar at the Battle of the Trident, when he crushed in the prince's breastplate with his warhammer and sent Rhaegar's body floating downstream in the river, he must have felt that he had won, that he had avenged every wrong and would soon reclaim his stolen bride. But Lyanna was not at the Trident. She was far to the south, in a tower in Dorne, and by the time Eddard Stark found her there, following the war's conclusion, she was dying. She died in a bed of blood, her brother holding her hand, speaking words that Ned would never repeat to anyone, leaving mysteries that would echo through the next generation. She never married Robert. She never became Lady Baratheon and Lady of Storm's End. She never had the life that had been planned for her since childhood, the life her betrothal promised. Instead, she had, perhaps, a year or less with Rhaegar, whatever that year was like, and then death at the age of 16 or 17, young and gone before she could tell her own story in her own words. Robert would sit on the Iron Throne, having won it by right of conquest and a distant Targaryen grandmother who gave his claim a veneer of legitimacy. He would marry Cersei Lannister in a different political arrangement, one meant to bind the Lannisters to the new regime. But he never stopped mourning Lyanna, never stopped believing that his one true love had been stolen from him, that if only he could have married her as promised, his life would have been different and better. Whether this was true or just a comfortable story he told himself, we cannot say. The Lyanna he remembered was frozen in time, forever young and beautiful and perfect, never given the chance to be a real woman with flaws and complications, never able to disappoint him or grow tired of his drinking and infidelities. The broken betrothal between Robert and Lyanna did not cause the rebellion in a direct mechanical way. It was not the betrothal itself that led thousands to die. It was the choices people made in response to it. The way Rhaegar's crowning of Lyanna cascaded into their disappearance together, which led to Brandon's rash confrontation with the king, which led to Aerys's mad executions, which led to Jon Arryn's choice to rebel rather than murder his wards. Each decision built on the previous one, each person acting according to their nature and their understanding of honour and duty, until what began as a prince giving flowers to a lady ended with the overthrow of a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 300 years. The personal tragedy at the heart of all this political upheaval was that no one got what they wanted. Rhaegar died believing perhaps that he was doing what prophecy demanded, but the prince that was promised, if such a figure even existed, did not save him from Robert's hammer. Lyanna died young. Whether she regretted running away with Rhaegar or whether she died content with her choices, we will never know. Robert won a throne he never truly wanted, lost the woman he believed he loved, and spent the rest of his life trying to forget his disappointments in wine and other women. Eddard Stark lost his father and brother, had to carry secrets he could never share, and lived with the knowledge of whatever Lyanna told him in that tower, and thousands of common people died in a war that began, in a sense, because a prince chose the wrong woman to give flowers to. If Robert and Lyanna's broken betrothal teaches us anything, it is that history has a way of repeating itself. That the patterns of human choice and consequence echo across generations. And nowhere is this more tragically evident than in the story of Robb Stark, who was not yet born when his Aunt Lyanna died in that tower in Dorne, but who would make choices that paralleled hers in ways that might have been poetic if they were not so devastating. Robb too would face an impossible decision between duty and desire. He too would break a sacred promise. And his broken betrothal, like his aunt's, would lead not just to personal tragedy but to the deaths of thousands and the near destruction of his house. The War of the Five Kings began in the year 298 after Aegon's conquest, when Eddard Stark was executed in King's Landing, and the North rose in rebellion, proclaiming Robb as their king in the North. Robb was 15 years old, barely more than a boy, thrust into leadership by circumstances he had not chosen and could not fully control. He had his father's sense of honour, his mother's determination, and the fierce loyalty of northern lords who would follow him anywhere. What he did not have was experience, political cunning, or the kind of flexibility that successful kings need when dealing with difficult and prickly allies. He was young and brave and honest, and these qualities, which made him admirable, also made him vulnerable. To wage war against the Iron Throne, Robb needed to move his army south, which meant crossing the Trident, which meant dealing with the Twins, the fortress that controlled the only practical river crossing for hundreds of miles. The Twins belonged to House Frey, and House Frey was led by Walder Frey, a man who was at that time something over 90 years old, who had outlived multiple wives and had more children and grandchildren than he could probably keep track of. And who was deeply, bitterly aware of how the great houses of Westeros viewed him. To understand why Robb's broken promise to House Frey mattered so much, we need to understand Walder Frey himself, to see the world through his eyes for a moment. House Frey was not an ancient house by Westerosi standards. They had not descended from the First Men or the Andal kings. They were a relatively new family whose wealth came from controlling that crucial river crossing and charging tolls to everyone who needed to cross. This made them rich, very rich indeed, but it did not make them respected. The older houses looked down on the Freys as upstarts, toll collectors who had gotten rich from their strategic position, rather than from any great deeds or noble lineage. Walder Frey had spent his entire long life being dismissed and overlooked by people he considered his equals or even his inferiors in everything but the antiquity of their bloodlines. During Robert's rebellion, Walder had stayed neutral as long as possible, finally bringing his forces to the Trident only after the battle was already won, Too late to make any difference, but just in time to technically be on the winning side. This earned him the nickname the late Lord Frey, a title that might have seemed merely descriptive but carried a sting of mockery, an implication of cowardice or at best excessive caution. Walder had swallowed this insult for years, had continued to be overlooked for high honours and prestigious marriages, had watched while lesser houses were given more respect simply because they had older names. All of this resentment, accumulated over decades, sat festering in the old man's heart. When Robb Stark's army arrived at the Twins, needing desperately to cross, Walder Frey saw an opportunity. Here was a great house, one of the oldest and most respected in all of Westeros, coming to him as a supplicant, needing something only he could provide. The young king in the north, the Wolf Lord, the heir to Winterfell itself, was about to beg for passage. Walder could set any terms he wanted, and Robb would have to accept them or see his war effort end before it truly began. This was power, the kind of power Walder had dreamed of having over the great houses all his life. Catelyn Stark negotiated the terms, speaking for her son, and the terms Walder demanded were steep. He wanted gold, yes, but more importantly he wanted marriages, binding connections between House Frey and House Stark that would elevate his family's status permanently. He demanded that Lord Eddard Stark's ward, Theon Greyjoy, marry one of Walder's daughters, though this was eventually set aside when it became clear that Theon's status was uncertain. He demanded that Arya Stark, when she was old enough, would marry one of his sons, creating a direct link between the houses. And most importantly, most centrally, he demanded that Robb himself marry one of Walder's daughters, or granddaughters, a marriage that would make some Frey girl the queen in the north, would make Walder Frey's blood flow in the veins of future Stark lords. For Walder, this betrothal was not just a strategic alliance, it was validation, recognition, the great houses finally acknowledging that the Freys were worthy of marrying into the noblest families of Westeros. For Robb, it was a price that seemed worth paying to get his army across the river and on with the war. He was 15, war was urgent. Marriage was something distant and abstract that could be dealt with later. He agreed to the terms, gave his word before witnesses, and crossed the Twins with his army. The betrothal was sealed, a sacred promise had been made, and House Frey was finally being treated as an equal by one of the great houses. But betrothals made in haste, under pressure, without much thought for the personal realities behind the political arrangements. These betrothals are fragile things, vulnerable to the complications that arise when abstract promises meet actual human feelings. Robb went south to war, won several important victories, established himself as a capable military commander despite his youth. The war ground on through months and then years. And somewhere in the Westerlands, at a castle called the Crag, Robb met a young woman named Jane Westerling, or in some accounts Talisa Maega, though the histories differ on who exactly she was and how they came to meet. The circumstances of their meeting are somewhat murky, obscured by the fog of war and the different versions of events that emerged later. What seems most likely is that Robb was wounded in battle, not seriously but enough that he needed tending, and Jane, who had training in nursing and caring for the wounded, attended to him. They spoke, they spent time together, and something sparked between them. The accounts describe Jane as gentle and kind, beautiful in a softer way than the northern girls Robb had grown up around, someone who showed him tenderness in a time when his life was all violence and command. Whether it was truly love or simply the human need for comfort in wartime, whether it was a deep connection or just the intensity that comes from proximity during crisis, we cannot say with certainty. What we know is that at some point, Robb and Jane slept together, and Robb, raised by Eddard Stark, who had always taught that honour was everything, who had lived his whole life trying to be the kind of man his father would be proud of, could not bear the thought of having dishonoured this young woman. In his mind, he had taken her maidenhead, had compromised her virtue, and the only way to make this right was to marry her. His sense of honour, the very thing that made him admirable, demanded that he repair the harm he believed he had done. To abandon Jane now would be to behave like a cad, would be to use a woman and discard her, would be to violate everything his father had taught him about how a good man treats women. But Robb was already betrothed. He had given his word to Walder Frey. His promise to marry a Frey girl was the price of his army's crossing of the Twins, the foundation of an alliance he desperately needed to maintain. Breaking that betrothal would insult House Frey, would potentially cost him their military support, would demonstrate to every house in Westeros that the word of the king in the north could not be trusted. Every practical consideration, every strategic thought argued for putting aside whatever he felt for Jane and honouring his commitment to the Freys. But Robb could not bring himself to do it. The choice Robb faced was fundamentally impossible. There was no right answer, no path that did not involve betraying someone or something. If he married Jane, he betrayed his word to Walder Frey, damaged his alliance, called his honour as a king into question. If he abandoned Jane to marry a Frey, he betrayed what he believed his personal honour demanded, behaved in a way his father would have considered shameful, lived with the knowledge that he had used a young woman and discarded her when she became inconvenient. The gods of Westeros, whether the Seven or the Old Gods, had apparently decided to test this young king by putting him in a position where any choice would be wrong. Robb chose love, or honour, or comfort, or perhaps just the path of least immediate guilt. He married Jane Westerling in a small ceremony, making her his queen, binding himself to her in the eyes of gods and men, and in doing so he broke his sacred promise to House Frey. The betrothal that had secured the crossing of the Twins, that had brought the Freys into his alliance, that had promised Walder Frey the recognition he craved. All of this was shattered by Robb's choice to follow what he believed his personal honour demanded over what political necessity required. When word reached the Twins, Walder Frey's reaction was not mere anger, but something colder and more dangerous. He had been humiliated, publicly rejected by a great house yet again. The boy king had made him a promise, had accepted his hospitality and his alliance, and then had cast him aside like garbage when some Western girl caught his eye. All of Walder's old resentments, every slight he had endured over his long life, every time he had been called the late Lord Frey, every marriage alliance denied, every honour overlooked, all of it crystallised into a cold desire for revenge. He had finally been promised respect and it had been taken away. Someone would pay for that. Robb, realising the magnitude of his mistake, tried to salvage the situation. He could not undo his marriage to Jane. The vows had been spoken and the marriage consummated, but perhaps he could offer something that would satisfy Walder's wounded pride. He proposed that his uncle Edmure Tully marry one of the Frey daughters, offering a Tully instead of a Stark, a lord of a great house even if not a king. It was a substantial offer, meant to show that Robb still valued the alliance with House Frey, still wanted them as allies even if he could not personally fulfill the original betrothal. Edmure Tully was, to his credit, willing to accept this fate. He was in his 30s, unmarried, and while marrying a Frey was not what he might have chosen for himself, he understood the political necessity and was willing to sacrifice his own preferences to help his nephew salvage this crucial alliance. The wedding was planned to be held at the Twins, a great feast that would supposedly heal the breach between the houses and restore House Frey to Robb's coalition. Walder Frey accepted the offer, agreed to host the wedding, sent word that all was forgiven and the alliance was restored. But Walder Frey had not forgiven. He had calculated the value of his wounded pride against the value of the alliance, and he had found the alliance wanting. More importantly, he had found another ally. One who offered him something more valuable than Robb Stark's friendship. Tywin Lannister, the most powerful lord in the Seven Kingdoms, the man whose grandson sat on the Iron Throne, had reached out to Walder Frey with an offer. "Help us destroy Robb Stark," Tywin said, "and you will have the gratitude of the throne, rewards beyond what the doomed king in the north could ever give you." And Walder, nursing his grievances, seeing an opportunity to both avenge his humiliation and profit from it, agreed. Rose Bolton, Another of Robb's bannermen had made similar calculations. Rose was the lord of the Dreadfort, a cold and calculating man who had noted the direction the war was going, who had observed Robb's mistakes and measured them against the power of the Lannisters, and who had decided that loyalty to the Starks was a losing proposition. He too had entered into secret negotiations with Tywin Lannister, had agreed to betray his king in exchange for being made Warden of the North. The Red Wedding, as it would come to be called, was a conspiracy involving multiple betrayals, but at its heart was Walder Frey's desire for revenge against a young king who had broken his promise. The wedding feast itself began normally enough. Edmure Tully married Roslyn Frey, one of Walder's many daughters, and she was by all accounts lovely and kind, someone Edmure might have been happy with in different circumstances. There was music and food and wine, all the elements of a proper wedding celebration. Robb was there with his mother Catelyn and his loyal lords and knights, celebrating what they believed was the restoration of their alliance with House Frey, relieved that Robb's mistake had been repaired at relatively modest cost. They ate Frey's food, drank his wine, celebrated under his roof, all of which placed them under the sacred protection of guest right, the ancient law that said a host must not harm his guests, and guests must not harm their host. And then the musicians put down their instruments and drew weapons, and the doors closed, and Walder Frey's men began killing Robb Stark's followers. The Red Wedding was a violation of every rule of hospitality and honour, a crime so heinous that it shocked even people who were used to the brutality of war. Robb died with his pregnant wife Talisa, murdered before his eyes, with his mother watching before he himself was killed. Catelyn Stark, who had negotiated the original betrothal with Walder Frey, who had promised him that her son would keep his word, died screaming and mad with grief. The northern lords who had come to celebrate a wedding were slaughtered, along with their men-at-arms and household knights. Outside, in the camps where Robb's army waited, Rose Bolton's men fell upon the northern soldiers, killing them in their tents, burning their camps, slaughtering thousands who had no idea they had been betrayed by their own commanders. Common men who had marched south following their king, who had fought bravely in his battles, who had trusted their lords to keep them safe, died bewildered deaths, murdered by men they had thought were allies. The king in the north was dead, his mother was dead, his cause was destroyed, and House Stark, which had endured for thousands of years, was broken. All of this flowed from Robb's choice to marry Jane Westerling instead of honouring his betrothal to a Frey daughter. We can trace a direct line from that decision to the Red Wedding, from his broken promise to thousands of deaths. But we can also trace lines in other directions, to the circumstances that forced Robb to make the promise in the first place, to Walder Frey's lifetime of accumulated resentments, to Rose Bolton's cold ambition, to Tywin Lannister's willingness to embrace any tactic that would destroy his enemies. Robb's broken betrothal was the crack in the alliance that allowed all these other forces to pour through, but those forces existed independently of Robb's choice. Could Robb have avoided this catastrophe? If he had honoured his betrothal to the Freys, if he had put aside his feelings for Jane, or never allowed those feelings to develop in the first place, would he have lived? Perhaps. But perhaps Walder Frey and Roose Bolton would have found some other excuse to betray him, some other opportunity to change sides when the war turned against the North. Or perhaps Robb would have died anyway, in some different battle, in some different betrayal, because he was ultimately a talented commander, but an inexperienced king fighting against powers that exceeded his own. What we can say is that Robb faced the same impossible choice that so many others in these histories faced. Honour demanded one thing, politics demanded another, and his heart demanded a third. He chose to follow his heart and his personal sense of honour, rather than cold political calculation. It cost him everything, cost his followers everything, cost the North its independence and its king, and yet, can we truly say he was wrong to choose as he did? He tried to be the man his father raised him to be, tried to do right by a woman he had wronged, tried to live according to the values he had been taught all his life. That these values were incompatible with political survival is a tragedy, but it does not necessarily mean the values themselves were wrong. The broken betrothal between Robb Stark and House Frey was not really about love, not in the way Robert and Lyanna's story was or might have been. It was about honour and pride, about a young man trying to do what he believed was right, and an old man nursing grievances until they turned poisonous. It was about the fragility of alliances in wartime, about how quickly loyalty can turn to betrayal when circumstances shift, and it was about the price that common people pay when their lords break their promises, when political arrangements fall apart and the careful structures of alliance and obligation collapse into violence. If the Starks' broken betrothals teach us about honour colliding with desire, about northern rigidity meeting human weakness, then the Lannisters' many failed marriage alliances teach us something different. Something about power and its relationship to promises. House Lannister, the richest family in Westeros, whose seat at Casterly Rock overlooked gold mines that had been producing wealth for thousands of years, approached marriage the way they approached everything else, as a transaction, a tool, a means to an end. And yet their betrothals failed with remarkable frequency, each broken promise revealing something about how power can be both the maker and breaker of alliances, how those who have the most can also afford to discard the most carelessly. Cersei Lannister's story with broken betrothals begins before she was even old enough to understand what marriage meant. When she was young, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, her father Tywin took her to court to King's Landing, during one of the periods when he served as Hand of the King to Aerys Targaryen. Tywin had ambitions for his family that extended beyond mere wealth. He wanted to bind House Lannister to the Iron Throne itself, to make his blood royal blood. And the way to do this, the obvious path, was to marry his daughter to Prince Rhaegar, the heir to the throne. The silver-haired prince that every girl in the Seven Kingdoms seemed to dream about. Cersei herself embraced this possibility, with everything a young girl could bring to such dreams. She imagined herself as queen, imagined living in the Red Keep, imagined bearing royal children who would rule after Rhaegar. The young Cersei, by all accounts, was extraordinarily beautiful, golden-haired and green-eyed. Considered one of the loveliest girls in the realm, she had every reason to believe she would make a suitable match for a prince, that her beauty and her family's wealth and power would make the betrothal inevitable. She waited for Tywin to negotiate the arrangement, confident that her future was being secured, but Aerys Targaryen, who was already showing signs of the madness that would later consume him completely, rejected the proposal. He did so, moreover, in a way calculated to wound Tywin's pride as deeply as possible. He suggested that Cersei might make a suitable match for his younger son, Viserys, who was still a child, or perhaps she could serve as a lady-in-waiting to Princess Elia. The insult was clear. Aerys was saying that Tywin's daughter, for all her beauty and her family's wealth, was not good enough for the heir to the throne. He was saying that the Lannisters, for all their pretensions, were servants, not equals to the royal family. Tywin resigned as Hand shortly after this rejection, taking his family back to Casterly Rock, nursing his wounded pride and plotting his revenge, though that revenge would not come for many years. Cersei, who had built her whole sense of self around becoming queen, who had imagined her future with Rhaegar in elaborate detail, was left with nothing but disappointed dreams and growing resentment. The betrothal that never was, the promise that was never even made, shaped her perhaps more than an actual marriage would have. She spent the rest of her life chasing the crown she believed should have been hers, manipulating and scheming to become queen, even though the path to that position would be very different from what she had imagined as a girl. Years later, after Robert's rebellion, after Rhaegar died at the Trident and the Targaryen dynasty fell, Tywin found another way to make his daughter a queen. He negotiated her marriage to Robert Baratheon, the new king, the man who had won the throne by conquest and by his distant Targaryen blood. This was not a betrothal that could be easily broken. Robert needed Lannister gold to rebuild after the war, needed Lannister support to stabilise his new regime. Tywin needed the legitimacy that a royal marriage would bring to his family. The arrangement served both parties' interests too well to be refused. Cersei married Robert, became queen just as she had always wanted, and was utterly miserable. Robert was nothing like Rhaegar had been, nothing like the prince she had dreamed of marrying. He was loud and coarse, he drank too much, he never pretended to love her or even particularly like her. On their wedding night, he was so drunk he called her Lyanna, the name of the dead girl he actually loved. Every day of their marriage was a reminder to Cersei that she was second choice, that even becoming queen could not give her what she really wanted, which was to be loved and valued and chosen rather than merely politically useful. But before Cersei's own unhappy marriage bore its full bitter fruit, there was her son Joffrey's betrothal to Sansa Stark, an arrangement that seemed brilliantly strategic when it was made and disastrous by the time it was broken. The betrothal was negotiated shortly after Robert became king, part of the reconciliation between House Stark and House Lannister, both of whom had been on Robert's side during the rebellion. Joffrey, as Crown Prince, would marry Sansa, the eldest daughter of the Warden of the North. It would bind the most powerful northern house to the throne, would ensure that the next generation of Starks would have Baratheon royal blood, would create family ties that would make rebellion against the crown nearly unthinkable. Sansa Stark embraced this betrothal with all the enthusiasm of a young girl who had been raised on songs and stories about knights and queens. She was 11 when she was betrothed, 12 when she came to King's Landing, and she saw everything through a romantic haze that obscured the reality of what she was walking into. She thought Joffrey was handsome and princely, thought she was living a dream, thought her life was becoming one of the songs she loved. Even when small signs of Joffrey's cruelty emerged, even when he showed flashes of the vicious nature he had inherited from his mother, Sansa made excuses. Convinced herself it was just the behaviour of a spirited prince who would mature into a good king. The betrothal was already becoming complicated when Eddard Stark, Sansa's father, arrived in King's Landing to serve as Hand of the King. Ned began to uncover uncomfortable truths about the royal family, began to realise that Joffrey and his siblings were not Robert's children at all, but the products of Cersei's incestuous relationship with her twin brother Jaime. This discovery put Ned in an impossible position. He could not allow Sansa to marry Joffrey knowing what he knew, could not bind his daughter to a family built on such a monstrous foundation. But to break the betrothal, to reveal the truth about Joffrey's parentage, would be to threaten the stability of the entire realm, to plunge the Seven Kingdoms into war. Before Ned could navigate this impossible situation, before he could find some way to extract his daughter from the betrothal without triggering catastrophe, the Lannisters moved against him. Cersei, learning that Ned knew her secret, had him arrested for treason. Joffrey, who had just inherited the throne after Robert's death, could have shown mercy, could have sent Ned to the wall as the plan had been. Instead, in a moment of childish cruelty and arrogance, he ordered Ned's execution, had him beheaded in front of his daughters, in front of the entire court. That execution, that moment of impulsive violence, shattered the betrothal between Joffrey and Sansa far more completely than any formal dissolution ever could. How could Sansa marry the boy who had murdered her father? The betrothal remained technically in force for a time, with Joffrey and his mother pretending that Sansa was still his intended bride, keeping her hostage in the Red Keep as a valuable political prisoner. But everyone knew the marriage would never happen, that the alliance it represented was dead, that Sansa was being held not as a future queen but as a captive whose only value was as a potential bargaining chip. The formal breaking of the betrothal came after the Battle of the Blackwater, when Tywin Lannister needed to secure the alliance with House Tyrell, whose armies had saved King's Landing from Stannis Baratheon's assault. The price of that alliance was a marriage between Joffrey and Marguerite Tyrell, the beautiful and ambitious daughter of Lord Mace Tyrell. To make this marriage possible, Joffrey's betrothal to Sansa had to be set aside. The public reason given was that Sansa's family were traitors in rebellion against the crown, that her brother Robb had declared himself king in the north, that the Starks had broken faith with the Iron Throne. Therefore, the story went, the Lannisters were justified in breaking the betrothal that had been made in good faith, but was now politically impossible. Sansa stood in the throne room and watched as Joffrey formally set her aside, as he declared his intent to marry Margaery Tyrell instead. On the surface, this must have seemed like a liberation, a release from the nightmare of having to marry her father's murderer. And perhaps part of Sansa felt relief, felt gratitude at being spared that particular horror. But she was also being publicly humiliated, declared unsuitable, rejected in front of the entire court. And she was still a prisoner, still at the mercy of the Lannisters, still trapped in a web of politics and violence from which she could not escape. The breaking of Sansa's betrothal to Joffrey created an opportunity that Tywin Lannister quickly moved to exploit. If Sansa could not marry Joffrey, if she was no longer destined to be queen, she was still the heir to Winterfell in the eyes of those who did not recognise her brother Robb's kingship. Whoever married Sansa would have a claim to the north, could potentially use that claim to bring the Northern Lords to heel once the rebellion was crushed, and Tywin had the perfect candidate for this marriage, his youngest son Tyrion, the clever dwarf whom Tywin had always despised but who could serve this useful purpose. Tyrion Lannister's marriage to Sansa Stark was not technically a broken betrothal, because there had been no betrothal period. It was a forced marriage, arranged and consummated, or rather not consummated, but it belongs in this story because it represents everything that was wrong with using marriage as a purely political tool without any regard for the people being married. Tyrion did not want to marry Sansa. He knew she was a child, knew she was terrified of him and his family, knew that any marriage between them would be a mockery. Sansa certainly did not want to marry Tyrion, saw him as one of her captors, as another Lannister who represented everything that had destroyed her family. The wedding took place anyway, because Tywin commanded it, and neither Tyrion nor Sansa had the power to refuse. They stood before the sept and spoke the vows, but everyone present knew it was a farce. Tyrion, to his credit, refused to consummate the marriage by force, refused to rape Sansa even though both law and custom said he had every right to do so. He told her they would not share a bed until she wanted to, which in the circumstances meant probably never. This decision, this small mercy in an ocean of cruelty, meant that the marriage remained unconsummated, which would later provide grounds for annulment. But in the moment, it meant only that Sansa's captivity had acquired a new dimension, that she was now legally bound to a Lannister, owned by them in yet another way. Cersei herself faced another unwanted betrothal in the aftermath of the War of the Five Kings, when Tywin attempted to bind the Lannisters even more closely to the Tyrells through multiple marriages. He arranged for Cersei, who had been queen and was now queen regent for her son Tommen, to marry Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, the handsome young brother of Margaery. For Cersei, this represented a profound humiliation. She was being married off like a girl, like a piece on a board, despite being a woman in her 30s who had already been queen, who had already borne children, who considered herself above such arrangements. And she was being married to a boy young enough to be her son, a boy who was widely rumoured to prefer the company of men to women, a boy who clearly had no interest in her, beyond the political advantages the marriage would bring his family. Cersei fought against this betrothal with every weapon at her disposal, political and otherwise. She schemed and manipulated, trying to find some way to avoid a marriage she viewed as beneath her dignity. The betrothal was eventually set aside, though not through anything Cersei did. The chaos that followed Joffrey's death at his own wedding feast, the accusations and trials and religious upheaval that consumed King's Landing, all of this created circumstances where the planned marriage to Loras simply never happened. It was a betrothal that faded away rather than being formally broken, lost in the larger catastrophes that overtook House Lannister. But there was one Lannister betrothal that was actually honoured, at least temporarily, one marriage alliance that seemed like it might work despite all the scheming and violence that surrounded it. Princess Myrcella, Cersei's daughter, was sent to Dorne as part of a peace arrangement, betrothed to Trystane Martell, the son and heir of Prince Doran of Dorne. This betrothal made strategic sense. Dorne had remained neutral during the War of the Five Kings, neither supporting the Lannisters nor joining their enemies. Binding Dorne to the Iron Throne through marriage might secure that great southern kingdom's loyalty, might prevent them from making common cause with any future rebellions against Lannister rule. Myrcella, by all accounts, was unlike her brother Joffrey in temperament. She was gentle and kind, well-mannered and thoughtful, someone who seemed to genuinely want to make the best of her situation in Dorne. Trystane was similarly decent, a young man who seemed to actually care for Myrcella, who treated her well during her time in Sunspear. The betrothal might have led to a genuinely successful marriage, might have been one of those rare cases where political necessity and personal compatibility aligned. But Myrcella's fate was sealed not by anything she did, or anything Trystane did, but by the larger currents of politics and revenge that swirled around the houses to which they belonged. Oberyn Martell, Trystane's uncle, had gone to King's Landing seeking justice for his sister Elia, who had been murdered along with her children during the sack of King's Landing at the end of Robert's rebellion. The Mountain, Gregor Clegane, had killed Elia and her babies, and Oberyn believed that Tywin Lannister had ordered those deaths. When Oberyn died in his trial by combat against the Mountain, when he was killed in a particularly brutal fashion after appearing to have won the fight, his paramour Ellaria Sand and his bastard daughters, the Sand Snakes, wanted revenge against the Lannisters. And the most available Lannister, the most vulnerable target, was Myrcella. The young princess was poisoned, killed by Ellaria in an act of revenge that violated every law of hospitality and honour, that broke the very betrothal that was supposed to create peace between Dorne and the Lannisters. Myrcella died, an innocent child destroyed by conflicts that had nothing to do with her, by hatreds that preceded her birth. The betrothal between her and Trystane, which might have been one of the successful ones, which might have brought genuine peace and alliance, ended in tragedy and renewed enmity between the houses. Tommen, Cersei's youngest child, did actually marry Margaery Tyrell, though their marriage would be short and marked by Cersei's desperate attempts to undermine it. Margot was everything Cersei had once been, beautiful and young and charming, capable of manipulating men while appearing to be merely charming and gracious. She won Tommen's affection easily, became the person he relied on and listened to, which meant she had influence over the king that Cersei could not control. For Cersei, watching her son love his wife was unbearable, a reminder of her own failed marriage, a demonstration of how she was being pushed aside by a younger, more effective player of the game. The pattern that emerges from all these Lannister betrothals and marriages is one of House Lannister using marriage as a weapon, as a tool of power, but finding that the weapon often turned in their hands. They broke betrothals when it suited them, forced marriages when it advanced their interests, treated other people's children as game pieces to be moved around the board. But these broken promises and forced alliances did not bring House Lannister the security they sought. Instead, they created enemies, generated resentments, demonstrated to everyone in Westeros that Lannister promises could not be trusted. When the Lannisters were strong, when they had armies and gold and control of the Iron Throne, they could afford to break their promises with relative impunity. But when their power began to wane, all those broken promises became debts that would be called in. Cersei's life, in particular, can be read as a series of broken betrothals and failed marriages, each one teaching her that she could not have what she wanted through the conventional paths available to women in Westeros. She could not marry Rhaegar and become queen that way. She had to marry Robert instead, and that marriage was loveless and brutal. She could not guide her son Joffrey's marriage to someone she could control. She had to watch him marry Margaery Tyrell, who threatened her influence. She could not avoid being betrothed to Loras Tyrell, could not escape her father's plans for her. Every betrothal, every marriage, every romantic entanglement in Cersei's life taught her that the traditional feminine path to power, through being someone's wife or mother, was insufficient and unreliable, and so she turned to other methods, darker methods, methods that would eventually destroy everything she was trying to protect. The Lannisters believed that their wealth and power made them immune to the normal rules about keeping promises, honouring betrothals, treating marriage alliances with the respect they deserved. They believed they could make and break these arrangements at will, that their ability to reward and punish would make up for any lack of consistency or honour in their dealings. And for a time, this worked. But the history of broken betrothals teaches us that promises have power beyond the immediate political calculation, that every broken vow creates a debt, that treating people as disposable pieces in a game eventually catches up with even the wealthiest and most powerful families. If the Lannisters approach marriage as a cold transaction, using betrothals and broken promises as tools of power, without much regard for sacred vows or personal feelings, the Targaryens had a relationship with marriage that was somehow both more sacred and more transgressive, more bound by tradition, and more willing to shatter convention when they believed circumstances demanded it. House Targaryen, the Dragon Lords from Old Valyria, brought with them customs that scandalized Westeros from the moment they arrived. Customs that created unique complications when Targaryen betrothals failed, or when Targaryen princes and princesses chose desire over duty. The Targaryen practice of marrying brother to sister, of keeping the bloodline pure through incestuous unions, was a tradition brought from Valyria, where it had been common among the Dragonlord families. The Targaryens believed, or claimed to believe, that their ability to bond with dragons was carried in their blood, and that this blood must be kept pure, undiluted by mixing with the blood of lesser families. This was not mere snobbery, or not only snobbery. The dragons were real. The bond between Targaryen and dragon was real, and the fear that this bond might be lost if the bloodline was compromised was genuine. So brother married sister, uncle married niece, and the silver hair and purple eyes that marked the dragon blood remained distinct and unmistakable, generation after generation. But this practice created unique problems when it came to marriage alliances. If Targaryens were supposed to marry each other, how could they also use marriage to create alliances with the great houses of Westeros? The solution, for much of their dynasty's history, was a careful balance. The heir to the throne, the one who would sit on the Iron Throne and needed to keep the dragon blood strongest, would often marry a sibling or close relative, but younger children might be married to great lords or ladies, creating ties between the throne and the noble houses. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed the Targaryens to maintain both their precious bloodline and their political alliances. The Faith of the Seven viewed Targaryen incest as an abomination, a violation of natural law and divine will. When the Targaryens first conquered Westeros, this theological opposition to their marriage customs created significant tension. The Faith militant, the military arms of the Faith, actually rose in rebellion partly over this issue, demanding that the Targaryens abandon their incestuous practices and marry according to the Faith's laws. It took dragon fire and political manoeuvring, and eventually a kind of uneasy truce to resolve this conflict. The Targaryens were allowed to continue their traditional marriages, granted what was called the doctrine of exceptionalism, which held that the normal laws of gods and men did not apply to them because they were fundamentally different, touched by dragon magic, set apart from common humanity. This exceptionalism, this claim to be above normal rules, meant that when Targaryens broke betrothals or abandoned marriage plans, the consequences rippled differently than when other houses did the same. They were already operating outside the normal framework of Westerosi marriage customs. When they transgressed even further, when they broke promises or pursued unions that were forbidden even by their own standards, the destabilization was profound. If the Targaryens, who claimed special privileges based on their special nature, could not even honor their own commitments, what did that say about the foundations of their rule? Rhaegar Targaryen's story, which we touched upon earlier in the context of Robert and Lyanna, looks different when viewed through the lens of Targaryen marriage customs. Rhaegar was married to Elia Martell of Dorne, a marriage that represented the alliance between the Iron Throne and Dorne, between House Targaryen and House Martell. This was not a sibling marriage, but a political one, meant to bind Dorne more closely to the crown after generations of Dornish independence and suspicion of Targaryen rule. Elia was, by all accounts, a good wife to Rhaegar, gentle and kind, though her health was delicate and childbearing was difficult for her. She gave Rhaegar 2 children, a daughter named Rhaenys and a son named Aegon, but the maesters told her that another pregnancy might kill her. This meant that Rhaegar's line was secured. He had an heir and a spare, as the saying went. But it also meant that Elia could give him no more children. For a prince obsessed with prophecy, with the idea of the prince that was promised who would save the world from darkness, this limitation may have seemed catastrophic. The prophecy spoke of 3 heads of the dragon, 3 children who would fulfill some great destiny. Rhaegar had 2 children. He needed a third, and Elia could not give him that third child without risking her life. What Rhaegar did next, whether he abducted Lyanna Stark or ran away with her willingly, whether it was driven by love or by prophecy or by some combination of both, represented a breaking of vows that went beyond a mere betrothal. Rhaegar was married to Elia. If the accounts are to be believed, he somehow had that marriage annulled or set aside and married Lyanna in a secret ceremony. This was not just breaking Lyanna's betrothal to Robert, though it was that. It was abandoning his own wife, casting aside a woman who had borne him children and represented a crucial alliance, for reasons that seemed to make sense only to Rhaegar himself. The Targaryen practice of polygamy, which Aegon the Conqueror had employed when he married both his sisters, had been abandoned by later generations under pressure from the faith. So Rhaegar could not simply take a second wife while remaining married to Elia. He had to dissolve his marriage to her, had to find some septon willing to declare that first marriage invalid despite the 2 children it had produced. The theological and legal gymnastics required to make this happen must have been extraordinary. But Rhaegar apparently accomplished it, married Lyanna, and left Elia and her children in King's Landing, where they would eventually be murdered when the city fell to the rebels. Whether Rhaegar believed he was acting righteously, following the dictates of prophecy for the good of the entire realm, or whether he was simply a man who wanted what he wanted and found grand justifications for selfish choices, we cannot know. He took his reasons to his grave at the Trident when Robert's warhammer crushed his chest. What we do know is that his actions, his breaking of marriage vows and his participation in the breaking of Lyanna's betrothal to Robert, set in motion the war that destroyed his family's dynasty. The Targaryens, who had ruled for nearly 300 years, fell because a prince chose prophecy or love over duty and alliance. And the child that came from Rhaegar's union with Lyanna, if the whispers and hints in the histories are to be believed, was Jon Snow raised as Ned Stark's bastard, never knowing that he was actually the legitimate son of a Targaryen prince and a Stark lady, that he had a claim to the Iron Throne that might have been stronger than anyone else's. Jon's entire existence was a consequence of broken betrothals and broken marriages, a living reminder that when promises are shattered, the effects echo down through generations in ways that could never be predicted or controlled. The Targaryens in exile, Viserys and Daenerys, the last children of Aerys the Mad King, carried the burden of their family's fall as they wandered the free cities with nothing but their names and their diminishing expectations. Viserys, the older brother, styled himself King Viserys III, though he had no kingdom and no realistic prospect of getting one. He was bitter and increasingly unstable, his mind perhaps touched by the same madness that had consumed his father. And he had plans for his little sister Daenerys, plans that involved using her the way Targaryen women had always been used, as a marriage alliance to gain power. But Viserys' initial plan was not to marry Daenerys to some foreign lord or powerful ally. His first thought, his deepest desire, was to marry her himself. This would have been traditional, even expected by old Targaryen standards. Brother marrying sister was what Targaryens did to keep the bloodline pure. With Viserys and Daenerys as the last known Targaryens, the last carriers of the dragon blood, marrying each other would have been almost obligatory if they were to restore their house and keep the ancient blood undiluted. Daenerys grew up knowing, or suspecting, that this would be her fate, that she would be her brother's wife and queen when he reclaimed the throne he believed was rightfully his. But Viserys was desperate and powerless, living on the charity of merchant princes and sellsword companies, moving from city to city as his welcome wore thin. He needed an army to reclaim Westeros, and he had no way to get an army except by selling the one thing of value he possessed, which was his sister. So the plan to marry Daenerys himself was set aside, and instead she was betrothed to Khal Drogo, the most powerful of the Dothraki warlords, a man who commanded a khalasar of 40,000 warriors, men and women who lived on horseback, who were said to be the finest light cavalry in the world. This betrothal was about as far from traditional Targaryen practice as could be imagined. Daenerys, a girl of 13 or 14, descended from the dragon lords of old Valyria, promised to a Dothraki warlord who the Westerosi would have considered a barbarian, a savage, a man whose people had no cities, no written language, who took what they wanted through conquest and considered horses more valuable than gold. For Daenerys, who had no say in the matter, who was her brother's property to dispose of as he wished, the betrothal must have seemed like a nightmare, a fall from whatever small dignity she had maintained as a Targaryen princess into something worse than she could have imagined. The wedding took place in the Dothraki manor, with Drogo giving Daenerys gifts according to his people's customs, including a beautiful silver horse that she immediately loved. There was violence at the wedding feast, as there always was at Dothraki celebrations, people fighting and dying while the festivities continued around them. Daenerys was terrified, completely out of her depth, given to a husband who did not speak her language and whose culture she did not understand. On her wedding night, Drogo took her, and while he was apparently gentler than he might have been, it was still the experience of a child bride with no choice, no power, no voice in what was happening to her. But something unexpected happened in the months that followed. Daenerys learned the Dothraki language, learned their customs, found ways to survive and then to thrive in this completely foreign context. She discovered strengths in herself that she had never known existed. And she and Drogo, improbably, developed something that looked like genuine affection, perhaps even love. It was not a relationship of equals, could never be that given the circumstances of their marriage and the vast difference in their ages and power. But it was not simply brutality and subjugation either. Drogo seemed to genuinely care for his moon of his life, as he called her, and Daenerys found ways to influence him, to soften some of his harshness, to make a space for herself in a world that should have crushed her. The betrothal between Daenerys and Drogo was actually honoured, which in the context of all these broken promises is almost remarkable. Drogo did not cast her aside, did not break his commitment to her or to her brother. He accepted her into his khalasar, made her his Khaleesi, gave her status and protection within the Dothraki social structure. When she became pregnant with his child, he celebrated, spoke of the stallion who would mount the world, the son who would be the greatest Khal who ever lived. For all its strangeness, for all the ways it violated Westerosi and Valyrian customs alike, the marriage between Daenerys and Drogo was one of the few in these histories that was not broken by choice or ambition, or the clash of duty and desire. It was broken instead by death. Drogo took a wound in a fight, a wound that should not have been fatal, but that festered and poisoned his blood. Daenerys, desperate to save him, turned to blood magic, to a Megi who promised to heal the Khal. But magic always has a price, and the price for Drogo's life was everything Daenerys valued. Her husband was saved, technically, but left in a vegetative state, alive but not living, his eyes empty, his strength gone. Her child was stillborn, twisted and monstrous, the sacrifice the magic demanded, and Daenerys was left alone. A widow among the Dothraki who had no use for the widow of a Khal who could no longer lead. The betrothal and marriage between Daenerys and Drogo teaches us something different from the other broken promises we have examined. It teaches us that even the most unlikely alliance, even a marriage that begins in terror and cultural incomprehension, can sometimes develop into something genuine. That people can adapt to circumstances that seem impossible, can find ways to survive and even flourish in contexts that should destroy them. But it also teaches us the fragility of all these arrangements. Drogo and Daenerys' marriage was honoured, was real, mattered to both of them, and it was still destroyed, not by broken promises, but by the simple fact of mortality, by the reality that in a violent world, death comes for everyone eventually. The earlier history of House Targaryen contains another crucial broken betrothal, one that led to the most devastating civil war the Seven Kingdoms had ever seen until that point. This was the conflict known as the Dance of the Dragons, which occurred roughly 170 years after Aegon's conquest. King Viserys I had a daughter, Rhaenyra, from his first marriage, and he named her his heir. Had all the great lords swear oaths that they would support her claim to the throne after his death. But Viserys later remarried to a young woman named Alicent Hightower, and she gave him sons, including Aegon, who many people believed had a stronger claim to the throne simply by virtue of being male. Viserys attempted to solve this problem, to prevent conflict between his children, by arranging betrothals that would unite them. Rhaenyra was to marry Aegon when they both came of age, uniting the two strongest claims to the throne in one marriage. It was a sensible plan, the kind of thing that had prevented conflicts in the past. But Rhaenyra was significantly older than Aegon, and she did not wait for him to grow up. She married someone else, had children by him, and those children's legitimacy would later be questioned. The betrothal between Rhaenyra and Aegon, which might have prevented a war, was never formalised properly or was set aside, and when Viserys died, the realm split between those who supported Rhaenyra's claim and those who supported Aegon's. The Dance of the Dragons was catastrophic. Brother fought sister, dragon fought dragon, and by the end of it, most of the Targaryen dragons were dead, along with thousands of people who had the misfortune to live during the civil war. The conflict could perhaps have been avoided if Rhaenyra and Aegon had married as children, if their claims had been united rather than set in opposition. But the betrothal failed or was never properly made, and the consequence was the near destruction of House Targaryen's power, the loss of the dragons that had made them special, the shattering of their mystique of invincibility. What makes Targaryen broken betrothals particularly significant is that the Targaryens claim to be exceptional, to be set apart from ordinary humanity by their dragon blood and their ancient lineage. The doctrine of exceptionalism that allowed them to practice incest and polygamy was premised on the idea that they were different, that normal rules did not apply to them. But this exceptionalism cut both ways. When Targaryens broke their promises, when they abandoned marriages or betrothals, when they pursued personal desires over political necessities, the consequences were not just political, but almost metaphysical. They were demonstrating that even they, for all their claims of special status, were subject to human weaknesses, to the same conflicts between duty and desire that afflicted everyone else. And because the Targaryens' power rested partly on mystique, on the sense that they were chosen by the gods, touched by magic, inherently superior to common humanity, every demonstration of human weakness undermined that mystique. Rhaegar abandoning Elia for Lyanna, Daenerys being sold to Drogo like a slave, Rhaenyra and Aegon never marrying and thus triggering a civil war. All of these failures of the marriage alliance system were also failures of Targaryen exceptionalism. They showed that dragons could be killed, that Targaryens could be just as foolish and short-sighted as anyone else, that the blood of old Valyria did not actually make them immune to the consequences of broken promises. The ultimate irony is that Jon Snow, if he was indeed the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, represented both the fulfillment and the failure of Targaryen exceptionalism. He had the blood of the dragon, was potentially the prince that was promised, if such prophecies meant anything, carried the legacy of both Stark and Targaryen. But he was raised as a bastard, knew nothing of his heritage, lived his entire life believing himself to be the shameful secret of Eddard Stark rather than the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne. All of Rhaegar's grand plans, all his belief that prophecy justified breaking his marriage to Elia and participating in the destruction of Lyanna's betrothal to Robert, led to a son who did not even know who he was. The prophecy, if it was fulfilled at all, was fulfilled in ways Rhaegar never imagined, in ways that made all his carefully calculated rule-breaking seem like just another example of human presumption leading to unintended consequences. The Dance of the Dragons, that terrible civil war that consumed House Targaryen and nearly destroyed everything Aegon the Conqueror had built, deserves our deeper attention because it shows us what happens when marriage alliances stop being tools of peace and become weapons of war. When betrothals are made not to prevent conflict but to secure advantage in a conflict already underway. The dance was in many ways a failure of the entire system of marriage politics, a demonstration that when a house fights itself, when family turns against family, even the sacred bonds of betrothal cannot hold the centre together. King Viserys I, as we mentioned earlier, had created the conditions for this war through his choices about marriage and succession. His first wife, Aemma Arryn of the Vale, gave him a daughter, Rhaenyra, but died trying to give him a son. Viserys named Rhaenyra his heir. Had the great lord swear oaths to support her succession, seemed to settle the matter definitively. But then he remarried, taking as his second wife Alicent Hightower, daughter of his hand, and Alicent gave him what Aemma could not, multiple sons who survived to adulthood. The eldest of these sons was Aegon, and many people, particularly those close to Queen Alicent, believed that Aegon should inherit simply by virtue of being male, despite Viserys's clear designation of Rhaenyra as his heir. The seeds of conflict were planted in these marriages, in Viserys's choices about who would follow him on the throne, but those seeds might not have sprouted into full civil war if the marriage alliances surrounding Rhaenyra and Aegon had been managed differently. If Rhaenyra had been betrothed to Aegon when they were children, if their claims had been united in marriage, the realm might have remained whole. But Rhaenyra was significantly older than her half-brother, and by the time Aegon was old enough to marry, Rhaenyra was already wed to Laenor Velaryon, a match that brought the powerful Valyrian fleet and the wealth of House Velaryon to her side. This marriage to Laenor was itself complicated by whispers that would not be silenced. Laenor was said to prefer the company of men to women, and when Rhaenyra bore children, when she gave birth to 3 sons named Jacaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey, those children had dark hair and features that looked nothing like the silver-haired Velaryons or Targaryens. Instead, they looked remarkably like Sir Harwin Strong, the son of the Hand of the King, who spent a great deal of time in Rhaenyra's company. Whether these boys were truly Laenor's sons or Harwin's bastards paraded as legitimate heirs became a question that divided the realm and would be central to the war that followed. When Viserys died in the year 129 after Aegon's conquest, the succession crisis erupted immediately. Queen Alicent and her faction, which became known as the Greens because of the green dress Alicent wore at a crucial moment, moved quickly to crown Aegon as king, despite Viserys's clear wishes that Rhaenyra should succeed him. Rhaenyra and her faction, known as the Blacks because of the black Targaryen colours she favoured, rejected Aegon's coronation and prepared to fight for what they believed was her rightful throne. The realm split almost immediately, with houses choosing sides based on a complex mixture of principle, self-interest, old alliances, and personal relationships, and marriage alliances, betrothals made and broken, kept and violated, became crucial weapons in the conflict that followed. Both sides needed allies, needed houses to commit their armies and resources to one claimant or the other. And the traditional way to secure such commitments, the tried and tested method of binding houses together, was through marriage. But in the context of a civil war, marriage alliances took on a desperate, almost frantic quality. These were not careful arrangements made over months of negotiation, not thoughtful matches designed to bring long-term stability. These were deals made quickly, promises offered to secure immediate military support, betrothals designed to win today's battle with little thought for tomorrow's consequences. Jacaerys Velaryon, Rhaenyra's eldest son and her designated heir, became a crucial figure in securing alliances for the Black faction. Jace, as he was called, was sent on diplomatic missions throughout the realm, visiting houses that might support his mother's claim, offering marriages and other inducements to secure their loyalty. He went to Winterfell and met with Lord Cregan Stark, who agreed to support Rhaenyra's claim. The alliance with the North was sealed, in part, through a betrothal between Jace and Lord Cregan's daughter, or in some accounts through promises of future marriages between the Stark and Targaryen lines. The exact terms varied in different tellings, but the substance was clear. House Stark would support Rhaenyra, and marriage ties would bind the two houses together. Jace also went to the Vale, where his grandmother Aemma had come from, where the Arryn connection to the throne was still remembered and valued. The Vale had always been loyal to House Targaryen, and the young Lord Jane Arryn, who ruled the Vale at that time, agreed to support Rhaenyra's claim. But the Vale's support, like the North's, came with expectations of future marriages, of betrothals that would reward their loyalty and bind them more closely to whichever Targaryen faction emerged victorious. But perhaps the most crucial marriage negotiations during the early days of the dance involved the Stormlands and the Baratheons. Storm's End was strategically vital, controlling the approach to King's Landing from the south, and both sides desperately wanted House Baratheon's support. Lord Boros Baratheon was, by all accounts, a proud man, conscious of his house's importance, and eager to extract maximum advantage from whichever side he chose to support. He was also a man with several daughters of marriageable age and no sons, which meant he was looking for advantageous matches that would secure his daughters' futures and his house's alliances. The Green faction sent Prince Aemond Targaryen to Storm's End to negotiate with Lord Boros. Aemond was Aegon's younger brother, already famous, or infamous, for having claimed the dragon Vhagar, the oldest and largest of the Targaryen dragons after Balerion had died. Aemond arrived at Storm's End with an offer. He would marry one of Boros's daughters, whichever one Boros chose, and in exchange House Baratheon would support King Aegon's claim to the throne. It was a straightforward transaction, the kind that had sealed countless alliances throughout Westerosi history. A prince of the blood for a great house's military support, a marriage that would elevate one of Boros's daughters to royal status. But Aemond was not the only Targaryen prince to arrive at Storm's End that day. Lucerys Velaryon, Rhaenyra's second son, flew there on his dragon Arax, carrying his mother's message asking for Lord Boros's support. Luke, as he was called, was young, perhaps 13 or 14, and he came not offering marriage but demanding loyalty based on old oaths, reminding Boros that his father had sworn to support Rhaenyra's succession. It was perhaps not the most diplomatically astute approach to take with a proud lord who held the balance of power in his hands. Lord Boros, faced with two Targaryen princes offering different versions of legitimacy, chose the side that offered him something tangible. He accepted Aemond's offer, agreed to the betrothal, committed House Baratheon to the Green faction. Aemond would marry one of his daughters. The sources differ on which one, but the marriage would seal the alliance between Storm's End and King's Landing. It was a crucial victory for the Greens, securing the Stormlands and demonstrating that even houses with old oaths to Rhaenyra could be swayed by the right inducements. What happened next at Storm's End has been told and retold so many times that the truth is hard to extract from the legend. What seems clear is that Aemond and Lucerys had a confrontation, that old enmities between them flared up, that Aemond had a grievance against Luke related to the loss of Aemond's eye in a childhood fight. When Luke left Storm's End to fly back to Dragonstone, Aemond pursued him on Vhagar. Whether Aemond intended to kill his young nephew or merely frighten him, whether what followed was murder or a tragic accident, we cannot say with certainty. But Luke died that day, his dragon Arax torn apart by Vhagar. The boy himself falling into Shipbreaker Bay and disappearing beneath the waves. The death of Lucerys Velaryon transformed the dance from a political conflict into a blood feud. Rhaenyra had lost her son, killed by her half-brother's son, murdered in what was functionally an act of war. There could be no negotiation after this, no peaceful settlement. The war would continue until one side or the other was completely destroyed. And the betrothal that had helped secure Lord Borros' support, the marriage alliance between Aemond and a Baratheon daughter, was now stained with kinslaying, with the murder of a boy who should have been safe under guest right, who had come to Storm's End as an envoy. Daemon Targaryen, Rhaenyra's uncle and husband, had his own history of complicated marriages that played into the dance. Daemon had been married 3 times, each marriage telling us something about his character and his ambitions. His first wife had been Rhea Royce of the Vale, a marriage arranged when both were young, a marriage Daemon apparently despised. He called her his bronze bitch and made no secret of his contempt for her and for the Vale, when Rhea died in a hunting accident. There were whispers that Daemon had arranged her death, though nothing was ever proven. Daemon's second marriage was to Lyanna Velaryon, the daughter of the Sea Snake, one of the richest men in Westeros and commander of the most powerful fleet. This marriage brought Daemon into the Valyrian sphere, created ties that would later support Rhaenyra's claim when Daemon became her strongest military commander. Lyanna died in childbirth, or in some accounts died attempting to reach her dragon Vhagar to die a dragon rider's death rather than a woman's death in childbed. Her loss left Daemon a widower for the second time, but it also left him with daughters who carried both Targaryen and Valyrian blood, who would be valuable pieces in future marriage negotiations. Daemon's third marriage was to Rhaenyra herself, his niece, a match that scandalized many people even by the standards of Targaryen incest. Uncle marrying niece was not as transgressive as brother marrying sister, but it was still uncomfortable for those who followed the faith of the Seven. The marriage also had obvious political dimensions. Daemon was an experienced military commander, a dragon rider, someone who could help Rhaenyra secure and hold the throne. Rhaenyra gained a powerful ally and husband, someone who would fight for her claim with everything he had. The marriage produced children who would have strong claims in their own right, further complicating the succession picture. The betrothals made during the dance were not just about securing current alliances, but about promising future rewards, about offering the winners a stake in the new order that would emerge after the war. Young princes and princesses, some of them barely out of childhood, were betrothed to the sons and daughters of powerful lords, promised in marriage to secure armies and dragons and loyalty. These children had little say in the arrangements, were moved around like pieces on a board, their futures sold for military advantage in a war they had not started and could not control. The tragedy of these wartime betrothals was that so many of them never came to fruition. The princes and princesses died in battle or in assassinations, the dragons they rode were killed, the houses they were promised to switched sides or were destroyed. A betrothal made in the first year of the war might be meaningless by the second year, the intended husband dead, the intended wife's family attainted as traitors. The normal expectation that a betrothal would lead to a marriage, that promises made would be promises kept, broke down completely in the chaos of civil war. The dance also saw betrothals and marriages used as rewards for loyalty or inducements to switch sides. A lord who had been supporting the Greens might be offered a favourable marriage alliance if he would betray his faction and come over to the Blacks. A minor house that had stayed neutral might be promised a connection to the royal family if they would commit their forces to one side. The marriage market, if we can call it that, became incredibly active and incredibly cynical. with promises flying in all directions and very few of them being kept by war's end. What made the dance particularly devastating in terms of marriage alliances was that both sides were Targaryens. The houses that supported Rhaenyra and the houses that supported Aegon were not ancient enemies, but often had marriage connections to each other, had intermarried for generations, had blood ties that should have prevented them from killing each other. The Valerians, for instance, had married into the Targaryen line repeatedly. The Hightowers, Alicent's family, had also intermarried with the Targaryens. These were not foreign invaders or rival kingdoms, but family fighting family, and the betrothals that had been made in peacetime to strengthen family bonds became weapons used to divide the family in war. The end of the dance left the survivors dealing with a tangle of broken promises and half-fulfilled betrothals. Prince Aegon the Younger, Rhaenyra's son who would eventually become King Aegon III, was betrothed to Jaehaera, the daughter of King Aegon II, in a marriage designed to unite the two factions and heal the wounds of war. This child marriage, between two traumatized young people who had lost most of their families in the conflict, was meant to symbolize reconciliation. Whether it achieved anything beyond that symbolism is questionable. Jaehaera died young in circumstances that were suspicious, and Aegon III eventually married someone else. But the attempt to use marriage to heal the breach left by war followed the ancient pattern. The dance teaches us that marriage alliances, which can help prevent wars when made thoughtfully in peacetime, become corrupted when made during wartime. The desperation of civil war turns what should be sacred promises into mere tactical moves, temporary expedients offered and withdrawn, as the military situation changes. Young people who should have been protected, whose betrothals should have been made carefully with their long-term welfare in mind, instead become bargaining chips to be traded for immediate advantage. And the breakdown of trust that war creates means that even betrothals that are made in good faith are viewed with suspicion, seen as potential traps, or as promises that will be broken as soon as they become inconvenient. The Dance of the Dragons devastated House Targaryen in ways that went beyond the immediate death toll, horrific as that was. It killed most of the dragons, those magnificent creatures that had made the Targaryens special and powerful. It divided the noble houses against each other in ways that took generations to heal. It created hatreds and grievances that would simmer for decades. And it demonstrated that the Targaryen practice of using marriage to manage succession and secure alliances could fail catastrophically when the family itself fractured. All the betrothals in the world could not hold together a house determined to tear itself apart over who should rule. The great broken betrothals, the ones involving kings and princes and the fate of entire kingdoms, are the stories that fill the histories and live in songs. But for every Robert and Lyanna, for every Robb Stark and his broken promise to the Freys, there were dozens of smaller betrayals, broken betrothals between lesser houses, promises made and broken in circumstances that seemed minor at the time, but that nevertheless rippled outward, creating pain and consequences and sometimes violence on a smaller but no less real scale. These quieter failures of the marriage alliance system deserve our attention, because they show us that the problems we have been discussing were not limited to the great and powerful, but infected the entire social structure of Westeros from top to bottom. Dorne, that strange southern kingdom that resisted Aegon's conquest and maintained its independence for more than a century after the rest of Westeros had bent the knee, had its own complicated relationship with marriage alliances and broken betrothals. The Dornish did many things differently from the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. Their inheritance laws treated sons and daughters equally, allowing the eldest child to inherit regardless of gender. Their attitudes towards sexuality were more relaxed, acknowledging that people took lovers outside of marriage and that this was a private matter rather than a public scandal. And their approach to marriage alliances reflected these different cultural values, which created friction and misunderstanding when Dornish houses tried to make matches with houses from other regions. House Martell, the ruling family of Dorne, had a particular history of failed marriage alliances with House Lannister, a pattern of broken promises that created lasting enmity between two of the great houses of Westeros. The most famous of these failed betrothals involved Oberyn Martell, the younger brother of Prince Doran, and Cersei Lannister when both were children. Oberyn's mother, the ruling Princess of Dorne, had approached Tywin Lannister with a proposal when Oberyn and Cersei were both very young, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. The idea was to betroth them, to create an alliance between Dorne and the Westerlands, to bind these two wealthy and powerful regions together through marriage. Tywin's response to this proposal was not merely a rejection, but an insult calculated to wound Dornish pride as deeply as possible. He suggested that if the Martells wanted a Lannister match, perhaps Oberyn could marry Tyrion instead, Tywin's dwarf son whom he despised and was ashamed of. The implication was clear and devastating, that a Dornish prince was not worthy of marriage to Cersei, that the best the Martells could hope for was to take Tywin's unwanted son off his hands. For the Dornish, who prided themselves on being equals to any house in Westeros, who had never been conquered, who maintained their independence and their distinct culture, this was an unforgivable slight. Oberyn never forgot this insult. It festered in his heart for decades, adding to his already considerable list of grievances against House Lannister. When Oberyn's sister Elia was murdered during the sack of King's Landing, when her children were killed, and when the Lannisters benefited from these murders by cementing their alliance with the new Baratheon regime, Oberyn's hatred of the Lannisters became personal and absolute. The broken betrothal that had never quite been a betrothal, the insult disguised as a marriage proposal, was part of the background that led Oberyn to King's Landing seeking vengeance, that led to his death in trial by combat, that led eventually to more Martell deaths and the near extinction of the direct Martell line. The Dornish approach to marriage itself was different enough from the rest of Westeros to create complications even when betrothals were made in good faith. In the rest of the Seven Kingdoms, marriage was supposed to be exclusive, and while men might take mistresses and father bastards, there was at least a pretense that the marriage bed was sacred and that wives should be faithful. In Dorne, the practice of taking paramours, lovers who were publicly acknowledged and sometimes given nearly the status of a spouse, was accepted and even expected among the nobility. This meant that when a Dornish lord or lady married someone from another region, there were often misunderstandings about what the marriage actually meant, what fidelity required, what obligations each party had to the other. These cultural differences made Dornish marriage alliances fragile, in ways that alliances between more culturally similar regions were not. A northern lord marrying a Dornish lady might be shocked and offended when she took a paramour, seeing it as adultery where she saw it as normal behaviour. A Dornish lord marrying a woman from the Reach might find her attitudes about female modesty and proper behaviour impossibly restrictive and ridiculous. These cultural clashes did not always break betrothals or end marriages, but they created stress and disappointment, made what should have been mutually beneficial alliances into sources of ongoing friction. The Iron Islands, home to the Ironborn who followed the drowned god and lived by raiding and reaving, faced different challenges in making marriage alliances with the rest of Westeros. The Ironborn were viewed by most of the Seven Kingdoms as barely civilized savages, pirates whose culture celebrated taking what belonged to others, who paid the iron price through conquest rather than the gold price through trade. The great houses of the mainland were willing to ally with the Greyjoys when military necessity demanded it, but they were not eager to marry their daughters to Ironborn lords or to send their sons to marry Greyjoy daughters. Asha Greyjoy, the daughter of Balon Greyjoy who led the Iron Islands rebellion against Robert Baratheon, was by all accounts a capable woman, intelligent and strong, someone who might have made a valuable alliance for many houses. But her father could not easily arrange prestigious marriages for her because of the stigma attached to the Ironborn culture. The few betrothals that were discussed usually involved minor houses or political situations where someone needed Ironborn naval power, badly enough to overcome their distaste for Ironborn customs. These proposed matches often fell apart when circumstances changed, when the immediate need for Ironborn ships passed, when a better alliance presented itself. Theon Greyjoy, Asher's brother, grew up as a ward of House Stark after his father's failed rebellion, and he lived in a kind of liminal space between two cultures, two sets of expectations. He was raised at Winterfell alongside the Stark children, and there seems to have been an implicit understanding, never quite formalised but present in everyone's minds, that Theon might eventually marry one of the Stark daughters, probably Sansa. This would have been a brilliant match for House Greyjoy, would have elevated them from defeated rebels to marriage kin of one of the great houses. For Theon, it would have meant fully integrating into northern society, becoming a Stark in all but name. But this implicit betrothal, this vague future promise, was never made explicit, never formalised, and when the time came for actual marriages to be arranged, Theon was overlooked. He was a hostage, a ward, someone who was tolerated and even liked, but he was not truly one of them. Sansa was betrothed to Joffrey Baratheon instead, a connection to the throne that was far more valuable than a connection to the Iron Islands. Theon's sense of rejection, his feeling of being neither Stark nor Greyjoy, neither truly northern nor truly Ironborn, contributed to his disastrous choices when he returned to the Iron Islands and tried to prove himself to a father who despised him for having been raised soft among the Starks. For the smaller houses, the ones without great wealth or powerful armies, marriage alliances were even more crucial and even more fragile. A minor house in the Riverlands, for instance, might arrange a betrothal with a minor house in the Crownlands, hoping to create a connection that would benefit both families, that would allow for mutual support in disputes with larger neighbours. These betrothals were negotiated carefully by the lords and ladies involved, sometimes with the help of local septons or maesters who understood the legal requirements, sometimes just through direct negotiation between the families. But these smaller betrothals were vulnerable to interference from larger houses in ways that matches between great houses were not. If a great house decided it wanted something from one of the families involved in a minor betrothal, if a powerful lord demanded that the betrothal be broken so that the daughter could marry his son instead, there was often little the smaller house could do to resist. The broken promise would create enemies, would damage the smaller house's reputation for reliability, but refusing a great house's demand might be even more dangerous. The maesters at the Citadel kept careful records of betrothals throughout the realm, noting which houses had made promises to which other houses, tracking the complex web of alliances and obligations that bound the nobility together. These records were supposed to provide a kind of institutional memory, a way to verify which betrothals had been properly made and which were merely rumours or wishful thinking. A master serving a lord could write to the Citadel to confirm whether a betrothal had been registered, whether the proper forms had been followed, whether the promise was legally binding. But even the master's careful record-keeping could not prevent broken betrothals when circumstances changed, when powerful people decided that old promises no longer served their interests. The records showed what had been promised, but they could not enforce those promises, could not compel lords to honour commitments they no longer wanted to keep. The maesters could note in their records that Lord so-and-so had broken his betrothal to Lady such-and-such, could create a historical record that would show future generations that this lord was not trustworthy. But in the moment this did little to help the wronged party or to prevent the consequences of the broken promise. The ripple effects of broken betrothals among smaller houses could be just as destructive in their local context as the breaking of royal betrothals was on the national stage. A broken betrothal might lead to a blood feud between two minor houses in the Vale that would simmer for generations, with periodic outbreaks of violence that killed dozens of people, even though no one outside the region ever heard about it. A lord who broke his promise to marry his daughter to a neighbouring lord's son might find that when his own lands were threatened by raiders or wildlings, that neighbour declined to send help, letting old grievances prevent the cooperation that might have saved lives. There were broken betrothals that resulted from simple changes of heart, from young people who had been promised to each other as children growing up and finding they could not stand each other, could not imagine spending their lives together. In these cases, if both families were reasonable and willing to negotiate, sometimes the betrothal could be dissolved without too much acrimony, perhaps with some compensation paid to the injured party, perhaps with an alternative match arranged that satisfied everyone. But this required goodwill on all sides, required everyone involved to prioritise the long-term relationship between the houses over wounded pride or short-term advantage. More often, broken betrothals among smaller houses resulted from the larger political currents that swept through Westeros. When the War of the Five Kings erupted, when the realm divided into competing factions, many smaller houses found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict from houses they had made betrothals with. A Riverlands house that supported Robb Stark might be betrothed to a Crownlands house that supported the Lannisters. The war made the betrothal impossible, turned former allies into enemies, and yet the formal breaking of the betrothal, the acknowledgement that the promise could not be kept, added one more small wound to the thousands being inflicted during that bloody conflict. Common people, peasants and merchants and craftsmen also made betrothals, also promised their children in marriage to create alliances or improve their families' situations. These common betrothals were not recorded in the Maester's books, were not matters of high politics, but they mattered immensely to the people involved. A farmer who had promised his daughter to a neighbouring farmer's son, planning for the day when the two farms would be joined and managed together, might find that promise broken when war came through the region and the young man was conscripted into some lord's army and died in a battle he did not understand, fighting for a cause that had nothing to do with him. Or a merchant who had betrothed his daughter to the son of a merchant in another city, planning to expand his trading network through this alliance, might find the betrothal broken when the other city was sacked by a passing army, and the other merchant's family was killed or scattered. These were not political betrayals in the way we have been discussing them. They were not choices made by ambitious lords pursuing power. They were simply the ordinary tragedies that war and violence inflict on common people, who have no control over the great events that determine their fates. The cumulative weight of all these smaller broken betrothals, these promises made and broken by minor houses and common people, is harder to measure than the impact of broken royal betrothals. We can trace a direct line from Robert and Lyanna to the fall of the Targaryen dynasty, from Robb and the Freys to the Red Wedding. But the hundreds or thousands of smaller broken promises that occurred across the same period created a diffuse damage, a general erosion of trust and social cohesion, a sense that promises meant less than they once had, that the old rules were breaking down. In the Reach, there were minor houses whose marriage alliances with each other formed a complex web of mutual support and obligation that had existed for centuries. When the War of the Five Kings forced some of these houses to support different sides in the conflict, when old betrothal promises had to be broken because the families were now enemies, this ancient social fabric began to fray. The same pattern repeated across the Seven Kingdoms. In every region, at every level of society, marriage alliances that should have prevented conflict instead became casualties of conflict, and the breakdown of these ties made future conflicts more likely, because the bonds that had held communities together were weakening. The pattern that emerges from looking at these smaller betrayals is that they followed the same basic logic as the grander ones we have examined, just on a reduced scale. Duty conflicted with desire. Political necessity clashed with personal honour. Changing circumstances made old promises inconvenient. The same impossible choices that faced kings and princes also faced minor lords and common people. The same tragic outcomes resulted when promises were broken, just with fewer witnesses, smaller armies. Deaths that were not recorded in the histories but that mattered just as much to the people who suffered them. What these smaller stories teach us is that the problems with the marriage alliance system were systemic, not just the result of particularly bad decisions by particularly powerful people. The entire social structure of Westeros was built on promises, on the assumption that people would keep their word, that betrothals made would be betrothals honoured. When that assumption began to break down, when more and more promises were being broken for more and more reasons, The whole system became unstable. Every broken betrothal made the next one easier to justify, created a precedent that others could point to when they wanted to escape their own inconvenient promises. After examining so many broken betrothals, from the grandest royal promises to the quietest arrangements between minor houses, we might step back and ask ourselves what all of this means, what these stories teach us about promises and power, about the nature of obligation, and the price of breaking one's word. These are not simple questions with easy answers, and perhaps that is appropriate. The contemplation of difficult questions, the turning of problems over in our minds without demanding immediate resolution, can be its own form of understanding, its own kind of peace. What makes a promise sacred in Westerosi culture, or in any culture for that matter? At the most basic level, a promise is sacred because society needs it to be sacred. If people cannot trust each other's word, if agreements mean nothing, if every commitment is provisional and subject to being discarded when it becomes inconvenient, then cooperation becomes nearly impossible. The social fabric that allows people to live together, to plan for the future, to build institutions that outlast individual lives, all of this depends on some baseline level of trust that promises made will be promises kept. When we talk about the sacredness of betrothals in Westeros, we are really talking about the sacredness of the social order itself, the shared understanding that binds people together. The faith of the Seven taught that promises made before the gods were binding in a metaphysical sense, that breaking such promises was not just a social violation but a spiritual one, an offence against divine order. The Septons would say that when a man and woman were betrothed, the Seven themselves witnessed the promise, and to break it was to lie to the gods. To treat sacred things as profane, this religious framework gave betrothals a weight beyond mere political expedience. Even someone who cared nothing for social consequences, who had the power to ignore human disapproval, might hesitate to break a promise made before the gods, might fear divine retribution if not earthly punishment. In the north, where the old gods held sway, the sense of obligation was if anything even stronger, though expressed differently. The old gods did not speak, did not issue commandments, did not promise reward or punishment. They simply watched from the faces carved into the weirwood trees, silent witnesses to everything that happened before them. To break a promise made before a heart tree was to demonstrate that one's word meant nothing, that one had no honour, that one could not be trusted in any matter. For the northern lords who valued honour above almost everything else, this was a fate worse than death, a kind of social annihilation that destroyed one's ability to function in a society built on trust and obligation. But if promises are sacred, if breaking them is so harmful to both the individual and society, why did so many people throughout Westerosi history break their betrothals? Part of the answer lies in the clash between different kinds of obligation, different claims on a person's loyalty and behaviour. A young man might feel obligated to honour his betrothal because he gave his word, because society expects it, because the political alliance depends on it. But he might also feel obligated to marry a different woman because he took her maidenhead and his honour demands he make her his wife. These two obligations are in direct conflict, and there is no way to fulfill both. He must choose, and whichever choice he makes, he will be breaking a sacred promise. This is the fundamental tragedy at the heart of so many broken betrothals. They are not usually the result of people being casually dishonourable, simply breaking promises because they feel like it. They are the result of impossible situations where multiple obligations collide, where duty points in one direction and desire in another, where keeping one promise requires breaking another. Robb Stark choosing between his betrothal to the Freys and what he believed was his personal honour toward Jane exemplifies this perfectly. He was not a bad person making a bad choice. He was a good person trapped in an impossible situation, trying to do right and finding that every option available to him involved doing wrong. The question of whether love or desire can justify breaking a betrothal made for political reasons is one that Westeros never resolved, and perhaps no society ever fully resolves. On one hand, there is something deeply sympathetic about the idea that people should be able to choose whom they love, that forcing someone into a loveless marriage for political advantage is cruel and wrong, that the heart has its own wisdom that should not be ignored. On the other hand, if everyone simply married whom they wanted regardless of promises and alliances, the entire system of political marriage would collapse, and with it one of the few mechanisms that prevented constant warfare between houses. The Westerosi solution, such as it was, tried to have it both ways. Marriages were arranged for political reasons, betrothals were made in childhood, but there was at least a rhetorical acknowledgement that the feelings of the people involved mattered, that a good match should try to consider compatibility and not just political advantage. In practice, this meant that powerful people, particularly men, could sometimes escape unwanted betrothals by finding reasons to dissolve them or by simply refusing to go through with them and bearing the political consequences. Less powerful people, particularly women, were expected to accept the matches made for them regardless of their feelings. This brings us to the gendered nature of broken betrothals, a pattern that runs through all the stories we have examined. When a man broke a betrothal, he faced political consequences, might lose allies or provoke enemies, but his personal honour and his desirability as a marriage partner generally remained intact. Robert Baratheon lost Lyanna, but he went on to become king and married Cersei Lannister in a prestigious match. Robb Stark broke his betrothal to the Freys and married Jane instead, choosing love over duty. The consequences were terrible, but they were political and military consequences, not questions about his worth as a man. When a woman was involved in a broken betrothal, whether she was the one who broke it or the one who was rejected, the consequences were different and often more personally damaging. Sansa Stark was set aside by Joffrey, and while this spared her from marrying her father's murderer, it also marked her as rejected, damaged goods in the eyes of many. The fact that Joffrey was a monster, and that being freed from betrothal to him should have been seen as fortunate, did not prevent people from viewing Sansa as somehow diminished by the experience. A woman who broke her own betrothal, who ran away or refused to marry as promised, faced not just political consequences, but questions about her virtue, her propriety, her fitness to be anyone's wife. This double standard reflects the broader reality that in Westerosi society, as in most medieval societies, women had far less agency than men in matters of marriage and sexuality. A woman's value was largely determined by her ability to make a good marriage, to produce legitimate heirs, to serve as a symbol of alliance between houses. A broken betrothal threatened this value in ways it did not threaten a man's value. The unfairness of this is obvious to us, looking back from our perspective, but to the people living in that time, it was simply how the world worked, an unchangeable reality that shaped every decision about marriage and betrothal. The question of consent, of whether people should have the right to refuse marriages they did not want, was one that Westeros acknowledged in theory but rarely honoured in practice. The faith taught that both parties to a marriage should consent, that forced marriages were invalid, but the definition of consent was elastic enough to be almost meaningless. A child of 10 could be said to consent to a betrothal if their father consented on their behalf. A young woman could be said to consent to a marriage if she did not actively fight and scream during the ceremony, even if she clearly did not want the match. The forms of consent were observed, while the substance was ignored. This meant that many betrothals involved at least one party who had never truly agreed to the arrangement, who was being married against their will, or at least without their will being consulted. When such betrothals were broken, when someone found a way to escape a marriage they had never wanted in the first place, was this really a betrayal? Or was it justice, the correction of an injustice that had been done to them? Lyanna Stark, if she did run away with Rhaegar willingly, was escaping a betrothal she apparently did not want, choosing her own path rather than accepting the one her father had chosen for her. Should we condemn her for this, or sympathise with her desire for autonomy? The role of prophecy in some of these broken betrothals adds another layer of complexity. Rhaegar Targaryen apparently believed that prophecy demanded he father a child with Lyanna Stark, that the salvation of the world somehow depended on him breaking his marriage to Elia and pursuing Lyanna instead. If he genuinely believed this, if he thought the alternative to his actions was the destruction of everything, does this justify what he did? Can cosmic necessity excuse personal betrayal? The problem with prophecy as justification is that it is inherently unprovable. Rhaegar believed he was fulfilling prophecy, but he might have been deluding himself, seeing meaning in vague portents that would never come true. And even if the prophecy was real, even if the prince that was promised needed to be born from Rhaegar and Lyanna's union, does the end justify the means? Does saving the world justify destroying individual lives, breaking sacred vows, causing a war that killed thousands? These are the kinds of questions that have no definitive answers, that different people will answer differently based on their values and perspectives. A pragmatist might say that results are what matter, that if Rhaegar's actions ultimately led to the defeat of the White Walkers or some other existential threat, then the broken promises and the suffering they caused were an acceptable price. A person who values honour and duty above all else might say that no outcome can justify breaking your word, that the means matter as much as the ends, that a world saved through betrayal and broken vows is not worth saving. Both perspectives have merit, and the tension between them is perhaps irresolvable. The alternative to all these broken betrothals, the question of what would have happened if everyone simply honoured their promises regardless of personal feelings or changing circumstances, is worth contemplating as well. If Robert and Lyanna had married as planned, if Robb had married a Frey daughter as promised, if Rhaegar had remained faithful to Elia, if all the betrothals we have discussed had been kept, would Westeros have been better off? In some cases, almost certainly yes. The Red Wedding would not have happened, thousands of lives would have been saved, but in other cases the answer is less clear. Perhaps Robert and Lyanna would have been miserable together, perhaps their unhappy marriage would have created different problems, different conflicts. The tragedy is that we can never know what might have been, can never compare the world that resulted from broken promises to the world that would have resulted from kept promises. We can only observe that broken betrothals caused enormous suffering, disrupted the social order, led to wars and deaths and shattered families. Whether keeping those promises would have prevented this suffering or simply shifted it elsewhere, whether it would have created different but equally serious problems, remains a mystery hidden in the paths not taken. What these stories ultimately teach us is that marriage in Westeros was never really about love or personal happiness, except accidentally, except in those rare cases where duty and desire happen to align. It was about power, about alliances, about binding houses together to create the political stability necessary for civilization to function. And the promises made in the service of this system carried enormous weight precisely because so much depended on them being kept. When people broke these promises, they were not just being personally dishonest, they were threatening the foundations of the social order, risking chaos and violence to pursue their own wants or needs or visions. But human beings are not machines designed to fulfill social functions. They have desires, fears, dreams, autonomy. They fall in love with the wrong people, feel trapped by promises made for them as children, discover that the future they were given is not the future they want. The conflict between the needs of society and the needs of the individual, between collective stability and personal freedom, runs through every broken betrothal we have examined. Westeros tried to resolve this conflict by prioritizing social stability, by demanding that individuals sacrifice their desires for the good of their houses and the realm. This worked, when it worked, to prevent some wars and create some alliances. But it also created immense personal suffering and, when it failed, led to conflicts just as destructive as the ones it was meant to prevent. Perhaps the deepest question is whether there could have been a better system, a way to create political alliances and social stability without requiring people to marry against their will, without turning children into bargaining chips, without treating love and desire as irrelevant or even dangerous. The Dornish, with their more flexible attitudes toward marriage and sexuality, toward paramours and legitimacy, had perhaps found a partial solution, a way to acknowledge human nature while still maintaining social order. But even Dorne had its broken betrothals, its political marriages that turned sour, its conflicts over promises made and broken. The question of whether any broken betrothal was truly justified, whether anyone in these stories made the right choice, depends entirely on what values we use to judge them. If we value political stability above all else, then almost all of these broken betrothals were mistakes, failures of duty that led to unnecessary suffering. If we value personal autonomy and the right to choose one's own path, then many of these broken betrothals were acts of liberation, people claiming the freedom that should have been theirs all along. If we value honour and promise-keeping as absolute goods, then the broken betrothals were all betrayals regardless of circumstances or consequences. If we value compassion and recognise the impossible situations people found themselves in, then perhaps we can sympathise with everyone involved. With those who broke promises and those whose promises were broken to them, with those who acted from duty and those who acted from desire. What seems clear is that the system of marriage alliances, for all its theoretical benefits, imposed enormous costs on the people trapped within it. These costs were not distributed equally. Women bore more of them than men. Common people bore more of them than nobles. Young people bore more of them than old people, who had already lived their lives before being married. And when the system broke down, when betrothals failed and promises were shattered, those same people bore the greatest costs from that breakdown as well. The wars that followed broken betrothals killed common soldiers and devastated peasant villages. The political chaos fell most heavily on those with the least power to protect themselves. In contemplating these questions, in turning over these problems in our minds, we might find ourselves feeling sympathy for everyone involved, for those who broke their promises and those who kept them, for those who sought freedom and those who chose duty, for those who acted from love and those who acted from honour. The great lesson of these broken betrothals might be that there were no easy answers, no clear heroes or villains, just people trying to navigate impossible situations with limited information and enormous pressure, making choices that seemed right at the time and living with consequences they could never have fully anticipated. The stories we have been exploring together, these tales of broken betrothals and shattered promises in the Seven Kingdoms of Westeros, might seem distant and fantastical, the stuff of dragons and direwolves, of a world that never existed outside the imagination. And yet, if we let ourselves contemplate these stories more deeply, we might recognise patterns that feel strangely familiar, echoes of our own world's history, reflections of universal human experiences that transcend the boundaries between fiction and reality. Between medieval Westeros and our own time and place, marriage as a political tool, as a way to create alliances between powerful families and secure the transfer of wealth and power across generations, is not an invention of fantasy literature. It is how human societies organised themselves for thousands of years, across virtually every culture and continent. The European nobility practiced arranged marriage with the same calculated precision as the lords of Westeros. Royal families betrothed their children in infancy, negotiated dowries and territorial concessions, used marriage to end wars or prevent them from starting. The marriage between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon united two Spanish kingdoms and created the foundation for a global empire. The marriage between Henry VII of England and Elizabeth of York helped end the Wars of the Roses, a conflict that, not coincidentally, bears remarkable similarities to the struggles for power in Westeros. These real historical marriage alliances were subject to the same pressures, the same potential for failure that we have seen in our fictional examples. King Henry VIII of England was betrothed to Catherine of Aragon when he was barely more than a child, married her after his brother's death, and then spent years trying to dissolve that marriage when he decided he needed a different wife, a different alliance, a male heir that Catherine seemed unable to provide. The breaking of Henry's marriage to Catherine was not exactly a broken betrothal, but it operated by the same logic, the same conflict between political necessity and existing promises. And it had similarly catastrophic consequences, splitting England from the Catholic Church, creating religious conflicts that would simmer for generations, leading eventually to civil wars and persecutions. The French monarchy used marriage alliances to manage their relationships with other European powers, marrying their daughters to Austrian princes or Spanish kings, bringing foreign princesses to France to bear heirs, and create bonds of blood and obligation. These marriages were notoriously unhappy more often than not. Marie Antoinette was married to the future Louis XVI when she was barely 15, sent away from her Austrian home to a foreign country, whose language she barely spoke, whose customs she did not understand, to serve as a living symbol of an alliance between Austria and France. Her life, her eventual execution during the French Revolution, the way she was used and then destroyed by forces far beyond her control, echoes in some ways the fates of women like Sansa Stark or Elia Martell, women whose value was entirely tied to whom they married and what alliances those marriages represented. But we need not look only to royal families to find these patterns. Across all levels of society, for most of human history, marriages were arranged by families for practical reasons, economic reasons, social reasons. A farmer's daughter would marry a neighbouring farmer's son to combine their family's lands, to create mutual obligations of support and assistance. A merchant's child would marry into another merchant family to expand trading networks, to share resources and information. The personal preferences of the people being married were rarely the primary consideration, and romantic love, if it existed at all in these marriages, was expected to develop after the wedding rather than before it. This created the same tensions we have seen in Westeros, the same conflicts between duty and desire, between what families wanted and what individuals wanted. Young people throughout history have run away to avoid unwanted marriages, have defied their parents to marry someone they chose themselves, have broken betrothals and faced the social and economic consequences of those choices. And families have responded with anger, with violence, with the severing of ties and the creation of feuds that could last generations. The Capulets and Montagues, whose conflict forms the background of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, were fighting partly over questions of marriage and alliance, over who had the right to marry whom and under what circumstances. The gradual shift in human societies, at least in some parts of the world, from arranged marriage toward marriages based on personal choice and romantic love, is a relatively recent development. And even now it is incomplete and contested. The idea that individuals should have the right to choose their own marriage partners, that love should be the primary consideration rather than family alliance or economic advantage, is a revolutionary concept in historical terms. It represents a fundamental reordering of priorities, a decision to value individual autonomy and happiness over collective stability and strategic planning. This shift has brought genuine benefits. People are, on average, happier in marriages they chose themselves than in marriages that were forced upon them. The reduction in arranged marriage has given women in particular far more control over their own lives, has freed them from being treated as property to be transferred between families. The recognition that marriage should be based on mutual affection and respect rather than just strategic calculation represents real moral progress. But this shift has also come with costs, with new forms of instability, new challenges in how societies organise themselves and plan for the future. The decline of arranged marriage has corresponded with higher divorce rates, with more complex and fraught questions about how to bind communities together when individual choice is prioritised over collective obligation. What the broken betrothals of Westeros teach us, what the real history of marriage alliances teaches us, is that there may be no perfect system, no way to organise marriage and family that serves both individual needs and social needs equally well. Every system makes trade-offs, privileges some values over others, creates benefits for some people while imposing costs on others. The arranged marriage system that dominated most of human history provided social stability and clear paths for the transmission of wealth and power. But it did so at the cost of individual autonomy and often individual happiness. The more modern system based on personal choice provides freedom and the possibility of happiness based on genuine affection, but it does so at the cost of some social stability and creates new anxieties about how to make good choices, how to know if we have found the right person. The stories of broken betrothals resonate with us, draw our attention, and engage our emotions. Perhaps because they dramatize tensions that we all feel in our own lives, even if we live in very different circumstances from the characters in these stories. We all make promises, undertake obligations, create expectations in others about our future behaviour. And we all sometimes find ourselves in situations where keeping those promises seems impossible, where circumstances have changed in ways we could not have anticipated, where what we thought we wanted turns out not to be what we actually want. The question of when, if ever, it is acceptable to break a promise, to walk away from an obligation, to disappoint people who are counting on us, is not unique to medieval marriage politics. It is a question we all face in various forms throughout our lives. When we hear about Robb Stark choosing love over duty, choosing to marry Jane and break his promise to the Freys, many of us feel sympathy for him, even knowing the terrible consequences. We understand the pull of genuine feeling, the difficulty of sacrificing personal happiness for political advantage, the way young people in particular can convince themselves that following their hearts is more important than keeping their word. Some of us have made similar choices in our own lives, have broken promises or commitments when we decided that the personal cost of keeping them was too high. We remember the guilt and the justification, the sense of being trapped between impossible alternatives, the hope that somehow it would all work out despite the broken promise. When we hear about Sansa Stark being betrothed to Joffrey, being trapped in a commitment she did not make and could not escape, many of us recognise that powerlessness, that sense of being moved around by forces beyond our control, of having our future determined by other people's decisions. Even those of us who have never been in an arranged marriage have likely felt trapped by circumstances, by expectations, by obligations we did not choose but cannot simply walk away from. The question of when we owe obedience to authorities who claim the right to direct our lives, and when we have the right to rebel and choose our own path, is one that every generation must answer for itself. The gendered nature of these broken betrothals, the way women bore more of the cost and had less of the agency, reflects patterns that persist in many societies even today. The idea that women's value is tied to their relationships, that a woman who is rejected or who makes unconventional choices is somehow damaged or diminished, has not entirely disappeared from our world. The double standards about sexuality and promiscuity, about who gets blamed when relationships fail, about whose reputation suffers more from scandal, all of these echo the patterns we have seen in Westeros. Recognising these patterns in fictional stories can perhaps help us see them more clearly in our own lives and societies, can help us question whether they are natural and inevitable, or whether they are choices we are making that we could make differently. The question of consent, which was so fraught and complicated in Westeros, remains complicated in our own world, though we have hopefully made progress in recognising its importance. The idea that both parties to a marriage should genuinely want that marriage, should enter into it freely and with full understanding of what they are agreeing to, seems obvious to most of us now. But the implementation of this idea is harder than it sounds. How do we know if someone truly consents, or if they are being pressured in subtle ways? How much knowledge and understanding is necessary for consent to be meaningful? How do we account for power imbalances that might make consent complicated or problematic, even when it is technically present? These are questions our societies are still struggling with, still debating, still trying to answer in ways that respect both individual autonomy and communal needs. The role of prophecy in some of the Westerosi broken betrothals, the idea that cosmic necessity might justify breaking personal promises, has its echoes in how we think about duty and calling in our own lives. Many people feel pulled toward particular paths, particular vocations or relationships, in ways that might conflict with previous commitments or expectations. Someone might break an engagement because they feel called to religious life, because they have discovered a vocation that is incompatible with marriage. Someone might leave a stable career and disappoint everyone who was counting on them, because they feel compelled to pursue a different path, to follow what they experience as a calling. How do we evaluate such choices? Is following what you believe to be your true path a valid reason to break promises to others? Or is it just selfishness dressed up in spiritual language? The answer likely depends on whether the calling is genuine or self-serving. But how can we ever know for certain? What draws us to these stories of broken betrothals, what makes them compelling and moving even when we know they are fictional, is perhaps that they let us contemplate these difficult questions at a safe distance. We can think about the tension between duty and desire, between individual choice and social obligation, between keeping our word and following our hearts, without having to immediately apply those thoughts to our own lives, without having to make binding decisions under pressure. Fiction gives us space to explore possibilities, to imagine ourselves in different situations, to think through the consequences of various choices without having to live with those consequences. And even though we know that Westeros is not real, that these specific broken betrothals never happened, the emotions and choices they represent are real enough. The grief of losing someone you love, the guilt of breaking a promise, the anger of being betrayed, the despair of being trapped in a situation you did not choose. These are all genuine human experiences that exist independently of the fictional framework in which they are presented. When we feel moved by these stories, when we find ourselves caring about characters and their dilemmas, we're responding to the reality of human experience even if the specific details are invented. Perhaps this is why stories endure, why we tell each other tales of love and betrayal, of promises made and broken, of the tension between what we want and what we owe to others. These stories help us think through our own lives, help us understand our own choices and the choices of people around us, help us develop sympathy and compassion for people facing impossible situations. They remind us that most people are trying their best, are struggling with forces and pressures we might not fully understand, are making choices that seem right to them, even if those choices hurt others. The broken betrothals of Westeros, for all their specificity, for all the dragons and dire wolves and medieval politics that surround them, are ultimately stories about the most fundamental human experiences. The need to make promises and the desire to break them. The longing for freedom and the weight of obligation. The hope that we can have both love and honour, both personal happiness and social stability, both individual choice and collective peace. The recognition that sometimes we cannot have everything, that choices have consequences, that trying to do right in a complicated world often means accepting that we will do some wrong in the process. As you contemplate these stories, as you let your mind drift through the halls of Winterfell and the Red Keep, through the deserts of Dawn and the iron halls of Pike, perhaps you can also let yourself think gently about your own promises, your own choices, your own navigation of the tension between what you want and what others need from you. Perhaps you can extend to yourself the same compassion we might extend to these fictional characters, the recognition that you too are doing your best in difficult circumstances, that your choices make sense given what you knew at the time, that the contradictions and compromises of your life are not unique failures, but the common human condition. The world can wait for tomorrow. Tonight, there is only the quiet contemplation of how we all struggle with promises and desire, with duty and freedom, with the endless negotiation between self and society that defines what it means to be human. We have travelled together through the broken promises of Westeros, through the choices made by lords and ladies, princes and common people, all of them trying to navigate the impossible space between duty and desire, between what they owe to others and what they owe to themselves. We have seen how love and honour can collide, how the best intentions can lead to the worst outcomes, how every choice carries consequences that ripple outward through generations, touching lives far beyond what we could ever imagine. These are not just tales of a fantasy realm, they are reflections of the eternal human struggle, the questions we all face about promises and freedom, about obligation and autonomy, about how to be true to both ourselves and to others. You have walked these paths with compassion, have contemplated these impossible choices without judgment, have allowed yourself to understand rather than condemn. Now let these stories settle into the quiet spaces of your mind. Let them become dreams if they wish, or let them fade into the peaceful darkness where all stories go to rest. Your breathing is slow and easy. Your body is comfortable and still. The great wheel of the world keeps turning. The maesters keep writing their histories. The old gods watch silently from their trees. And you are safe. You are warm. You are allowed to simply drift away. The night is long, but full of rest. Winter may be coming, but sleep comes first, gentle and kind. And now your watch has ended. Let go, friend. Let go and dream.